Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It starts with a question. A simple one. What if someone was watching you? A question that lingers longer than it should. At first, it seems absurd. Who would be watching me? But that question lingers in the back of my mind, twisting itself into something I can't shake off. The house feels different now. A little emptier, a little more isolated. We moved in just a few months ago, a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood. The walls, the floors, even the air, felt new. Safe. I used to sleep with a sense of calm, knowing everything was just where it should be. But now, something's changed. It all began with the camera. We installed it for safety, nothing more. A small camera in the corner of the bedroom, connected to our phone, just in case. I wasn't even sure why we did it at first. Maybe it was a mix of modern paranoia and the kind of people who still feel comforted by technology, no matter how silly it seems. The first night, we didn't think much of it. I remember lying in bed, watching the feed on my phone. The light in the room was soft, casting shadows against the walls. Nothing unusual. Just me, my wife, and the soft hum of the fan above. But then, around 2:15 a.m., I saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a flicker. The kind you might dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But then it moved, slipping past the corner of the frame. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and tried to shake off the feeling. It was probably just a trick of the light, I thought. Maybe the curtain moved, or the fan shifted the shadows. Nothing to worry about. But it didn't stop. Every night, the shadows returned. Sometimes small, sometimes large. Sometimes they moved slowly, creeping through the frame, other times fast, as if someone, was walking through the room while I wasn't looking. I began to dread the sight of that feed. I'd lie in bed, my eyes fixed on the phone screen, watching and waiting. Each night, the shadows grew more defined, more purposeful. At first, they were vague, just shifting black shapes. But soon, they began to resemble figures, tall, indistinct, moving with deliberate steps, almost as if they were aware of the camera. One night, I swear I saw one pause, just for a moment, directly in front of the lens. I couldn't breathe. I didn't say anything to my wife at first. I didn't want her to worry. But after a few days, I noticed she was becoming just as uneasy as I was. She wouldn't say it outright, but I could tell she didn't sleep well anymore. And when she did, her eyes would flicker open in the middle of the night, always looking toward the corner where the camera sat. I told myself I was imagining things. That I was just tired, or stressed, or maybe even a little paranoid. But when I sat in the living room the next day, staring at the footage, the truth was clear. The shadows weren't just passing through. They were waiting. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shadows in my mind, creeping through the room like silent, patient predators. I'd even begun to hear things, small noises, like faint scraping against the walls or a soft whisper that I couldn't quite make out. But when I looked around, the house was still, the air stagnant and heavy. My wife started noticing too. It wasn't just the camera anymore. There were moments when she would glance over at me, her expression distant, like she was hearing something I wasn't. Her fingers would twitch, and she'd pull the blanket up closer around her. I saw her look over her shoulder more than once, even though I knew no one was there. One night, we were both awake, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The light from the hallway crept through the door, casting long, angular shadows across the floor. I watched her, hoping she'd say something, anything that would explain the growing sense of dread that I felt. But she remained silent, her eyes fixed ahead. I heard something again, she finally whispered, her voice tight, barely audible. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady, though I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "It's like footsteps," she said, her eyes darting nervously to the door. "But they don't sound like they're from outside, they're here. In the house." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I'd heard them too. It was a sound I couldn't explain, a soft, almost imperceptible thud, like someone walking on the floorboards. It wasn't the house settling. I knew that. But it wasn't just the sounds. It was the feeling that came with it. The sensation that we were being watched. That the air around us was heavier, thick with something invisible. I glanced at the feed on my phone, the familiar blue glow in the dark. The camera, always running, had become my anchor. But tonight, I hesitated. The thought of looking at that screen, of seeing the shadows again, made my stomach churn. "Let's just turn it off for tonight," I suggested, trying to keep my voice calm. But she shook her head. "No. I want to see." I could tell she was as afraid as I was. But there was something else in her eyes, something more than fear. Curiosity, maybe. A need to understand what was happening to us. Reluctantly, I opened the app. We both stared at the screen. For a moment, nothing happened. The bedroom looked quiet, calm. But then, there it was. A flicker in the corner. A shadow. It moved quickly this time, sweeping across the screen in a fluid motion. It was so fast, so sudden, that it almost felt like the camera had missed something. We both froze. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Yes," she said softly, her eyes wide. But this time, it was different. The shadow didn't just pass by. It lingered, just for a second, as if it were waiting for us to notice. The outline of a figure was clearer now, a tall shape shifting in the darkness. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. We both stared at the screen, but there was nothing left. The room was empty again. But I could feel it. Something was there. Something that had been watching us. Waiting for us to look away. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was in the room with us, and it wasn't just the shadows. It was something else, something that had taken notice of us, something that knew we were watching. We didn't talk much after that. The silence between us was heavier now, filled with the unspoken fear that lingered in the air. Every night, we lay awake, waiting for the shadows to return, always just out of sight, always just beyond our reach. I started hearing the footsteps more often. But now, I wasn't sure if they were real, or if they were just in my mind. And then, one night, the camera feed showed something I wasn't prepared for. A face. Pale. hollow, staring directly into the lens. We weren't alone anymore. The face was there, staring into the camera, eyes wide open. It wasn't a blur like the shadows we had seen before. This was different. Clear. Defined. A pale, ghostly figure, its features sharp and hollow, almost gaunt, with a dark hollow where its mouth should be. I couldn't breathe. I froze, my finger hovering over the screen as the image seemed to stare back at me, unblinking, unmoving. "Did you see that?" I whispered to my wife, my voice barely more than a breath. She was sitting up now, her eyes glued to the phone screen, her face pale. She nodded, but didn't speak. The face was gone almost as soon as we'd noticed it, leaving behind the empty, quiet bedroom. But it wasn't gone from our minds. The sense of its presence lingered. That cold, unblinking gaze seemed to burn into my brain, each second of its appearance etched into my memory. We sat in silence for a long time, the sound of our breaths the only thing breaking the stillness of the room. The camera feed showed nothing but the empty corner of the bedroom. No shadows. No figures. Just the soft rhythm of the ceiling fan and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But something was different. The air felt heavier, as though it had thickened with an unseen weight. I could almost hear the room itself holding its breath, waiting. "I don't want to look anymore," my wife finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled slightly. "It's not just the shadows anymore. It's like it's watching us, waiting." I nodded, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. I had no idea what was happening, but it was clear now that it was no longer just an anomaly or a trick of the light. There was someone, inside our home. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking more now. "This isn't safe." But even as she said the words, I felt a pang of doubt. I didn't want to leave. Not yet. Part of me refused to accept that we were in real danger. I wanted answers. I needed to know what was happening. Who or what was in our home, and why? "We'll go tomorrow," I said. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if we could leave. Something in me felt tethered to this place now. It was as if the house itself was pulling us deeper into whatever was lurking in the dark corners. That night, we both lay awake in the silence, our eyes darting toward the shadows that stretched across the room. I could feel the weight of them, heavy and oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every shift in the air made my heart race. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I opened my eyes, the room was darker than it had been before. The clock on the wall showed 3:12 a.m. And that's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave." The voice came from somewhere just beyond the door, soft and drawn out, as if it were right next to me, breathing in my ear. My heart stopped. I shot upright in bed, my hands trembling as I grabbed for the phone to check the camera feed. But this time, the feed wasn't showing the room. It was showing the hallway. There, standing in the darkness outside our bedroom, was the same pale figure from the screen, the face. Its hollow eyes locked onto the camera, and then, slowly, it moved. It didn't walk, not in the way you or I would. It was like it was gliding, its feet barely brushing the ground as it came closer, closer to the bedroom door. I could feel my pulse racing in my throat as I watched it approach, each inch it moved toward us tightening the grip of fear around my chest. It stopped just outside the door. And then, to my horror, I saw it smile. Not a smile of warmth, not a smile of kindness. No. This was something different. A twisted, grotesque grin that stretched far too wide across its face, as if it had all the time in the world to make its intentions clear. It knew we were awake. It knew we were watching. And it was waiting. I wanted to scream, to shout, to call out to my wife, but my voice wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, staring at the screen, at the face that now seemed to loom in the darkness, just beyond the door. The figure stepped forward again, reaching for the doorknob. My breath caught in my throat. And then, the camera feed went black. No feed. No shadows. No figures. Just blackness. I grabbed the phone, shaking it, trying to bring the feed back. But there was nothing. The screen stayed dark. I could feel my wife's hand on my shoulder now, her breath cold against my skin. "We have to leave," she whispered. And this time, I didn't argue. But when I looked toward the door, the one the figure had been standing in front of, it was wide open. And something, or someone, was standing on the other side. The figure stood in the doorway. I couldn't see its face. Not clearly. But I felt it. That presence. Cold, oppressive, like a weight pushing down on my chest. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting, the silence between us thick enough to suffocate. I grabbed my wife's hand, squeezing it tightly, my heart pounding in my ears. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I could feel her fear, the way her body trembled beside me. "Do you see it?" she whispered, barely a breath. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the doorway. The figure didn't move. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen. No sound, no footsteps, no sign of life, just that cold, unnatural stillness. The kind of stillness that made the room feel like it was holding its breath. And then I heard it again, the faintest whisper, this time clearer. "Leave." The voice was closer now, right outside the door. I could almost feel it moving through the air, as though it were pressing against the very walls of the room. I tried to speak, to shout, to call for help. But my throat felt tight, my voice lost somewhere deep inside me. My wife's grip on my hand tightened as she looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me, my body frozen in fear. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It was almost like I was drawn to it, unable to look away, even as every instinct in my body screamed for us to run. But there was no way out. The door was wide open, and the hallway stretched beyond it, dark and endless. I could feel the air from the hall creeping into the room, cold and damp, like it had been there for centuries. "Don't move," I whispered to my wife. She nodded, her eyes wide and glassy, but she didn't say a word. I took a step forward, every inch of my body screaming to turn and run. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, an invisible force pushing me toward the door, toward the figure standing there. And then, the whisper came again, but this time it wasn't a command. It was a question. "Why are you still here?" The words were like ice, slicing through the air and freezing me in place. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It knew. It knew we hadn't left. I reached for the doorframe, my fingers brushing against the cold wood. My breath was shallow, each inhalation sharp and panicked. And then, before I could think, I stepped into the hallway. Everything changed in that moment. The temperature dropped. The hallway, once familiar, now felt alien, twisted. The walls seemed to shift, stretching away into darkness. The light from the bedroom felt distant now, like it was no longer part of this place. I turned to my wife, but she wasn't there. Panic surged through me. "Where are you?" I called out, my voice cracking. But there was no answer. I called again, louder this time. No response. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. And then I heard it. The softest of footsteps, faint but distinct, moving behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing. Only the empty, stretching hallway. The footsteps came again, closer now, right behind me. I felt a cold breath against my neck. "Turn around," a voice whispered, not from the darkness, but from within my own mind. I spun around, eyes wide, but I saw nothing. But I felt it. It was there, just behind me, close enough that I could almost feel its breath against my skin. "Leave," the voice said again, sharp, like a command. "You should have left when you had the chance." I felt something brush against me. A hand, cold as ice, like it had been reaching for me, just missing. I stumbled backward, heart racing, my mind screaming for escape, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. The shadows twisted around me, closing in, pulling me deeper into the void. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow. Not like the ones before, not like the ones on the camera. This was something else. A real presence. A shape, shifting and undulating, as if it were part of the darkness itself. It was coming toward me. I turned to run, but my feet were heavy, like I was moving through water, and every step felt like it took an eternity. I could hear the whispering voices now, all around me, their words indistinct but urgent. "Why don't you leave? Why do you stay?" I reached for the door, the handle slick with cold sweat. My hands fumbled for a moment before I finally twisted the knob and threw myself back into the bedroom. But it wasn't the bedroom anymore. The room had changed. The walls were darker, the air thicker. The familiar corner with the camera was gone, replaced by an empty, hollow space. There was no bed, no furniture, just the darkness stretching endlessly in all directions. And in the middle of the room, standing motionless in the center of the black void, was the figure. Its hollow eyes stared at me again. This time, it didn't whisper. It smiled. And then, everything went black. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in a void of nothingness. The world around me disappeared. The fear, the dread, it was all gone, swallowed up by the darkness. I don't know how long it lasted. But when I opened my eyes again, everything was normal. The bedroom, the bed, the familiar walls. The camera still sat in the corner, innocently recording. I looked over at my wife. She was asleep, but I could see the fear on her face, even in her dreams. And I knew we weren't alone anymore. The next night, I watched the camera feed again. I had to. I couldn't stop myself. The feed was still, quiet, empty. But I knew better now. I knew it was there, waiting. This time, though, there was no shadow. Nothing moved. But I couldn't help feeling the eyes on me, staring from the darkness, just beyond the lens. And I knew it would never stop. I should have known it wouldn't end with that. There's a part of you that believes, deep down, that things will go back to normal after something like this. That once you've seen the worst, the terror will fade, and you can go back to living your life. But it doesn't work like that. Not with something like this. The camera feed was calm, quiet. The familiar room, our room, was still. The shadows in the corner of the bedroom, once so full of movement, were now still and unmoving. The air felt thick, but I couldn't quite place the fear anymore. It was more like a dull ache in the back of my mind. I was tired, exhausted, mentally drained, but there was no escaping it. I kept watching. I needed to. And that's when I saw it again. Not the figure. Not the face. But something else. Something new. A faint flicker, as if the camera itself was malfunctioning. But it wasn't the glitching I had seen before. It was something deliberate. Something that seemed to pulse, slowly, as though it were testing the limits of the lens. I watched, heart racing again, waiting for something to appear. And then, the shadows shifted. For just a moment. A distortion, almost imperceptible, as if the room itself had breathed. And there it was. A whisper, barely audible. Not through the speakers, but in the very air, pressing against my ears, filling the room. Leave. It wasn't the voice from before. It was softer, distant, like a sigh. I could almost feel it in my bones, echoing through the room. I froze. The camera feed had never been like this before. It had always captured the room, clear, clean, static. Now, it felt like the camera itself was part of the trap. The walls in the feed seemed to shift in ways I couldn't explain, expanding and contracting, the edges of the room becoming blurred, like it wasn't a real space anymore. I turned to my wife, hoping she would tell me I was imagining things. Hoping she would reassure me, make it all go away. But she was awake. She had been awake for a while, her eyes wide, staring at the feed with that same look of dread that I felt crawling beneath my skin. "It's happening again, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft and hoarse. I nodded, unable to speak. I didn't want to admit it, but the truth was too clear. Whatever was in that room, whatever had been watching us, whatever had been in the shadows, it was still there. Still waiting. I reached out, but this time I didn't want to look at the screen. I didn't want to see anything else. But it was like I was drawn to it. My hand moved on its own, hovering over the phone. With a breath I didn't know I was holding, I tapped the screen, pulling the feed up again. The room was unchanged. Quiet. But the shadows were different. They seemed to gather, as if something was forming out of the darkness. Something was emerging, and it wasn't just the play of light. I knew it, felt it. Then, a shape took form, slowly. It was a figure. A figure that I couldn't make out at first, too shrouded in shadow. But as the seconds ticked by, the shape grew clearer. It was the same face. That pale, twisted, hollow face. It smiled again. But this time, there was something else. It wasn't just in the corner of the room anymore. It was closer. Moving. The figure seemed to be walking toward the camera. I felt my stomach drop. "Run," I whispered to my wife, panic flooding my voice. But it was too late. The figure wasn't moving toward the camera. It was moving toward us. I saw it clearly now. The edges of its features were sharp, jagged, like it was being pulled together from the darkness itself, its form stretching and distorting unnaturally. And then, I felt it. A shift in the air, like a heavy weight pressing on us. Something was standing behind us. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. My eyes stayed fixed on the screen, on the figure that was now inches from the lens. I could see the hollow eyes, the empty mouth stretching wider, impossibly wide, its grin now splitting its face. And then it spoke. Not through the feed, not through the phone, but right behind me. "Why did you stay?" The voice was cold, but familiar. It was the same voice from the hallway. The same whisper in my mind. Only now, it was stronger, more present, like it was coming from every direction at once. I slowly turned, the air thick with dread. And there it was. The figure, standing right in front of me. Its face, inches from mine, its cold breath brushing my skin. I could see its eyes, empty, hollow, and unblinking, staring straight into my soul. The room spun. My body felt light, like I was floating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, the figure raised its hand. I could see the long, thin fingers reaching for me, the skin stretched tight over the bones, its fingers twisting unnaturally, bending in ways they shouldn't. It touched my face. Cold. Cold as death. And then I heard the words again, whispered softly in my ear. "Leave." But I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The figure's grin widened, stretching across its face until it felt like it was going to tear apart. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in bed. The room was quiet. My wife was asleep next to me, her chest rising and falling gently. The camera feed was still running, the screen glowing softly in the dark. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The feed was clear. But there, in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the dark, a shadow, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that this time there would be no escape. Have you ever had a conversation where you're sure you heard something you weren't supposed to? Something that doesn't belong? That's how it started. A normal evening, just like any other. I was sitting in my living room, the room dimly lit by the glow of the television, when my phone rang. It wasn't unusual, phone calls were a regular part of my day. But this call, would change everything. I picked up, seeing the name of an old friend, Tom, on the screen. It had been a while since we had talked, so I answered quickly, expecting a casual catch-up. "Hey, Tom. Long time no talk." But the response wasn't what I expected. "Yeah, it's been a while," Tom said, his voice sounding a little distant, like he was speaking through a tunnel. "How have you been?" I leaned back on the couch, settling into the conversation. It was good to hear from him. We exchanged pleasantries, and soon the conversation shifted to more personal topics, like work, family, the usual stuff. Then, something strange happened. There was a brief pause in the conversation. A silence that stretched too long, too awkwardly. I wasn't sure if Tom had just paused to think, but it felt different. Like there was something else in the background. It was faint at first, like a soft rustling sound. Almost like paper crinkling or a faint breath. I thought maybe it was just some interference on the line, but the sound grew louder. It was clear now, someone else was there. I frowned. "Tom? You still there?" I asked, my voice uncertain. "Yeah, I'm here," he replied quickly. "Why?" I swallowed, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "Who else is with you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. I figured maybe he was with someone else, talking to me on speakerphone. But then, the voice that answered was not Tom's. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Hello." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. "Tom?" I said, my voice shaking now. "Who's that?" There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Tom's voice returned, sounding confused, even slightly annoyed. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone sharp. "No one else is here. It's just me." But the voice was still there, just as clear as before. "Hello," it whispered again. I looked at my phone, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I was certain I hadn't imagined it. There was someone else on the line, someone who shouldn't be there. "Tom, there's someone else on the phone," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Who's that?" There was another long pause, and then Tom responded, his voice sounding more urgent. "I swear, there's no one else here. It's just me. What are you talking about?" I could hear the disbelief in his voice, but it didn't change the fact that there was another voice on the line, faint but unmistakable. And that voice, was it laughing? I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Stop messing around," I said, my voice sharp now. "Who is that?" "I'm serious." I heard Tom's breath on the other end, then a click. The line went dead. I sat there, staring at my phone, unsure of what just happened. I dialed Tom's number again, waiting anxiously as the phone rang. It picked up on the second ring. "Hello?" Tom's voice came through, clear and familiar. But something was wrong. His voice sounded different. His tone was flat, emotionless. "Tom?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened?" "You hung up on me." "I didn't hang up," Tom replied, his voice sounding almost robotic, as if he were speaking from a distance. "I'm still here." "What do you mean?" I felt a chill run through me. I could hear him, but it wasn't the same. It was like he wasn't really there. I glanced at the phone in my hand. The screen was showing Tom's name, his contact photo, but somehow it felt wrong. Like I wasn't really talking to him anymore. The longer I listened, the more distant his voice seemed, as if he were fading away. And then, in the background, I heard it again. A whisper. "Leave." This time, it was louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from the phone, though. It felt like it was coming from inside my head. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at it in disbelief. My hands trembled as I hung up, disconnected from the call. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just crossed a line. Something had breached my privacy, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something had been listening. I tried to call Tom back, but there was no answer. His phone went straight to voicemail. I sat in silence for a long time, staring at my phone. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The atmosphere felt heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. The voice that wasn't Tom's. The one that whispered hello and laughed softly in the background. Who, or what, had been on the phone with me? I tried to convince myself it was just some technical glitch. Maybe an issue with the network, some weird interference. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The thought lingered in my mind. Had someone been listening to our conversation? Or was there something, or someone else entirely, trying to reach me? I didn't know. But one thing was certain, whatever happened that night, it wasn't over yet. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there, waiting. The silence that followed the strange call felt deafening. I sat there for what seemed like hours, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again. But it didn't. I tried calling Tom a few more times, but each time it went straight to voicemail. The phone in my hand felt heavier, colder, like it had somehow become an extension of the dread building inside me. The room felt different, too. The usual sounds of the house, distant cars passing, the soft whir of the air conditioner, were gone. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't place. I felt a strange compulsion to check the windows, the doors, to make sure I was alone. But nothing was out of the ordinary. Still, something inside me couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. I tried to focus on the rest of my evening, turning on the TV to drown out the silence. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. The one that wasn't Tom's. The one that whispered and laughed, the one that I couldn't explain. The longer I sat there, the more my thoughts spiraled. Who was that voice? What did it want? How had it gotten onto the line? And why had it said, leave? Around midnight, when the house had fallen into that deep, oppressive silence again, my phone rang. It was Tom's number. My stomach dropped. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the phone. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to not pick up. But the part of me that needed answers, needed closure, took over. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. Tom? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The response was immediate, but it wasn't Tom's voice. Hello. The voice was soft, familiar, but wrong. This time, it wasn't distant. It was right there, in the room with me. Close. Too close. I could almost hear the breath, as though it was standing beside me. My heart raced. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Who is this? What do you want? The voice on the other end didn't answer right away. Instead, it let out a low chuckle. It's just me, it said. The voice, at first, sounded like Tom. But then, it twisted, becoming deeper, heavier. Just me, still here? Tom? I asked again, my voice shaking now. What the hell is going on? Who's there? Silence. Then, that same voice, now colder, almost mocking. Leave. The word echoed in my ears, and for a brief moment, I couldn't breathe. My grip on the phone tightened, as if I could somehow squeeze the answers out of it. But the only thing that came through the line was that faint rustling sound, the same one from before, growing louder, more pronounced. I heard it then. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking on the other side of the door. But I hadn't heard anyone come in. No knocks, no creaks in the floorboards. Just those footsteps, drawing closer. My throat tightened. I should have hung up. Should have ignored it. But my curiosity and fear kept me rooted in place. I pressed my back against the couch, listening intently to the sound of those footsteps. They were too slow, too measured, like someone was pacing just outside my room. Then, through the phone, I heard the voice again. Do you hear them? I froze. They're coming for you. The words sent a chill straight to my bones. I wanted to scream, to shout, to throw the phone away and run. But I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, frozen, paralyzed by the terror clawing at my chest. And then, there it was. A knock. Soft at first, like a tap on the door. But as the seconds passed, the knocks grew louder, more insistent, more demanding. "Let them in," the voice whispered. I looked toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't hear anyone outside, but those knocks, they were real. Too real. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to run away, but I couldn't. My mind raced, my thoughts scattered. What was happening? Who was behind the door? Was it even a person at all? Was it the same thing that had been talking to me on the phone? I couldn't take it anymore. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I tried to steady myself, but it felt like the room was closing in. The knocking continued, louder now, as if whatever was outside had no intention of stopping. I stood up slowly, my legs barely holding me as I moved toward the door. I knew I shouldn't open it, but I couldn't just sit there, frozen, waiting for whatever it was to come inside. With a deep breath, I reached for the door handle, slowly turning it. And then, I stopped. The knocks had stopped. The room had fallen silent again, just like before. The air felt heavier, suffocating. I stood there, my hands still on the door, trying to listen, trying to hear anything that might explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no whispers. Only silence. I opened the door. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty. No one in sight. No sign of anyone or anything. I stepped out into the hallway, my eyes darting around, searching for anything that could explain the fear gripping me. But the silence was suffocating. The house was still. I wanted to believe it was just a prank. That Tom had somehow tricked me, messing with my head. But something deep inside me told me that this wasn't a prank. This wasn't something I could explain away. I closed the door behind me, my heart still racing. But as I turned to go back into the living room, I froze. The phone. It was ringing again. I looked at it, my pulse quickening. The caller ID, Tom's name. I couldn't pick it up. I knew I shouldn't. But I had to know. I had to hear the voice again. My fingers hovered over the phone, trembling. I had just gotten rid of the last call, yet here it was again. Tom's name on the screen. I knew I shouldn't pick it up. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to ignore it, to put the phone down, to escape whatever this was. But there was a stronger pull, something primal, something that pushed me to find answers, no matter how terrified I was. I swiped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear, my breath shallow, my heart thumping in my chest. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The voice that answered was unmistakable, yet strange. It was Tom's, but somehow not. The tone was wrong, flat, distant, like a recording, as if it were filtered through static or distortion. "Hello," it said again, but this time it lingered longer than before. The words seemed to stretch, becoming more unnatural, more mechanical. I took a shaky breath. "Tom? What's going on? Why are you doing this?" There was no response. Just the same eerie silence that filled the line. I could hear my own breathing, loud and shaky, echoing in my ears. My grip tightened on the phone, as if I could force it to stop this madness. "Who's with you?" the voice asked, but it wasn't Tom's anymore. It was different. Cold. echoing like a whisper from deep inside a well. The words were enough to send a shock of terror down my spine. The voice wasn't even trying to sound like Tom anymore. It was something else. Something darker. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at it. Tom's name still lit up the screen. I could see his contact photo, the one we'd taken years ago at a party, smiling together, carefree. But now it felt wrong. Distorted. Like everything about this was falling apart, shifting into something that didn't belong in my world. Leave now. The voice came again, this time louder. More urgent. And then, there was the unmistakable sound of something scratching the phone, faint but clear. As if someone was trying to claw their way through from the other side. I couldn't take it. I hung up. The moment my finger disconnected the call, I felt the room shift, like the air itself was thicker, more oppressive. I backed away from the phone, my head spinning, my thoughts racing. It wasn't Tom. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was something else. Something watching me. My pulse thudded in my ears. I rushed to the window, but there was nothing out there. Just the darkness of the street, the flickering lights of distant houses. No movement. No signs of life. I turned to look back at the phone, still lying there on the table. My legs felt unsteady as I moved toward it, but I couldn't leave it there. I couldn't just walk away. Something compelled me to pick it up again. And when I did, my heart skipped a beat. The screen was no longer showing Tom's name. Instead, it said unknown caller. I hesitated. For a long moment, I just stared at it, frozen in place. I didn't want to answer. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to leave it alone. But that insistent feeling gnawed at my insides, pick it up, find out what it wants. With trembling fingers, I swiped the screen once more. Hello? I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. The voice that answered was not Tom's. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was different. Darker. You're not safe. The words echoed in my head. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even breathe for a second. The air felt electric, charged with something I couldn't understand. Who is this? I gasped, trying to control my voice, but fear seeped through every word. There was a low chuckle on the other end, but it wasn't friendly. It was hollow. Like it was coming from somewhere deep, somewhere empty. It's not about who I am. The voice paused, and then added in a voice so soft, so chilling, I almost didn't hear it. It's about what you'll do next. The phone crackled, and for a moment, I heard the faintest sound of a heartbeat. Not mine. Not anyone's I knew. It was too much. Too overwhelming. The reality of it all was slipping away. Was this a prank? A terrible joke? Or was something far worse happening? Stop it. I shouted into the phone, my voice breaking. Stop messing with me. What do you want? The voice only laughed again, its laughter grating, the kind of laugh you would hear in a nightmare. Don't fight it. You can't stop it. I felt my stomach twist with dread. There was a new sound in the background now, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door, but far too fast, far too frantic. The sound wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was coming from somewhere else, right behind me. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway behind me was dark, but the sound, it was unmistakable. The tapping grew louder, more urgent. Closer. I ran toward the door, my heart in my throat, my breath ragged. The phone slipped from my hand, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to escape whatever was happening. I reached the door, my hand gripping the handle, but the tapping, no, scratching, grew louder, more insistent. Like something was trying to break through the walls, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I opened the door, and to my horror, the hallway was empty. But the tapping was still there. Only now, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from inside the walls. The floor. It was everywhere. The phone rang again, its shrill sound cutting through the madness. I glanced down at the screen. Unknown caller. I didn't want to answer. But somehow, I knew I had to. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone one last time. And the voice, now calm and detached, came through again. It's time to leave. I stared at the phone screen, still trembling. The voice on the other end didn't belong to anyone I knew, but it felt familiar in the worst possible way. It was calm, almost too calm, as if it had been waiting for me to finally pick up. Leave, the voice said again, softer this time, like a whisper curling around my ear. It was getting harder to breathe, harder to think. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing thick, suffocating. I turned away from the door, my mind racing. What was happening? Was it a prank? Some kind of twisted game? But the sound, the tapping, the scratching, coming from inside the walls, had convinced me this was no joke. This was real. The knocking, no, the scratching, was louder now, relentless, as if something was trying to claw its way through the drywall. It came from all around me. The ceiling, the floor, the walls. Each tap felt like it was pressing against my skin, sinking into my bones. I backed away from the door, my legs shaky, my body refusing to obey. I could feel the panic rising, choking me. Whatever this was, it was getting closer. The phone in my hand felt like it was burning my skin, but I couldn't let go. I couldn't put it down. I needed to know. What do you want? I gasped, barely able to speak through the panic. The voice on the other end didn't answer right away. Instead, there was that same soft laugh. It wasn't a laugh. It was the sound of something wrong, something that didn't belong. You're not alone, the voice finally said. You never were. I felt my heart stop for a moment. It was like a cold hand gripped my chest, squeezing tighter and tighter. I wanted to drop the phone, to run, but I couldn't move. You were always being watched. The voice continued, each word dripping with something sinister. They're here now. They've always been here. Suddenly, the scratching noise intensified. It was louder, closer. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with it, vibrating beneath my feet. I couldn't understand where it was coming from. There were no pipes, no ducts, nothing that should have made that noise. It was as if the very walls of the house were alive, twisting and moving in a way that wasn't natural. Then, there was a sound, faint but unmistakable. A low, guttural whisper, almost drowned out by the scratching, but still there, just beneath the surface. Help us. It was a voice, but not a human one. It was ragged, as though it had been dragged across years of silence. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty. The hallway outside was still. There was no one there. But then, I saw something, movement in the corner of my vision. A shadow, just a flicker, but it was enough to freeze me in place. It was tall, slender, and moved with a fluidity that didn't make sense. The figure seemed to be bending at impossible angles, its limbs elongating, distorting. My heart hammered in my chest, and I backed away from the shadow, my breath shallow, frantic. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its eyes. It was like the darkness itself had eyes. Cold, empty eyes. Leave. The voice on the phone spoke again, but now it wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was coming from the shadow. I turned and bolted for the door, the panic overwhelming me. But the moment I reached the handle, the door slammed shut, as if something invisible was holding it in place. I yanked at the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The scratching grew louder. The whispering voices, multiple now, filled the room, surrounding me. Help us, they chanted. Leave. I was trapped. The walls felt like they were closing in. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of something ancient, something malevolent. It was all around me now, the shadows, the whispers, the scratching. The voices were getting louder, more frantic. It felt like I was suffocating, like I couldn't escape. Suddenly, the room went cold. I could see my breath in the air. The temperature had dropped, and the chills sunk deep into my bones. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, moving closer. I turned, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. The shadow wasn't just standing there anymore. It was closer. It had moved toward me in a way that shouldn't have been possible, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it reached for me. I could hear its voice now, clear and cold. You can't leave. You never will. I screamed, my voice raw, but it was drowned out by the scraping noise that filled the room. It was like the walls themselves were bleeding, as if they were alive, pulsating, and reaching for me. I stumbled back, tripping over the phone, but I couldn't look away from the shadow. It was too close. The air was thick with a presence, an oppressive force that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't think, couldn't move. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the shadow was already too close. It was upon me. And then, just as I thought I would be consumed by it, the door opened. I didn't wait to see who, or what, was standing on the other side. I ran. I ran out into the hallway, into the night, away from the thing in my house. But even as I ran, I could feel it behind me, following me. The phone started ringing again. I didn't dare to answer. I never would. But the voice on the other end of the line never stopped. It would never stop. It would always be with me. I ran through the streets, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs weak and unsteady. The cold air bit at my skin, but it wasn't enough to clear the fog in my mind. The shadows, the voices, the incessant scratching, it all felt like it was following me, creeping just behind me, like a heavy weight I couldn't shake. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, ignoring the ache in my muscles, the tightening in my chest. Every corner I turned, every step I took, I felt it. That presence, that thing from the house, was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to find me again. The thought was suffocating. I couldn't escape it. I needed to stop. I needed to think. But every time I slowed, I heard it, Those whispers, like 1,000 voices in the back of my mind, pressing in from all directions. You can't escape. You can't outrun it. The sound of my breath became louder than everything else, but even that was drowned out by the phantom sound of tapping, scratching. It wasn't coming from behind me anymore, it was coming from inside my head. The walls weren't just in the house anymore, they were inside me. I stopped at the edge of the street, my hands on my knees, gasping for air. I looked around, trying to gather myself, but the world seemed so distant, so wrong. I was disconnected from it, from everything. My mind felt like it was spiraling, trapped in a loop, haunted by things I couldn't understand. The phone. I had to get rid of the phone. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for it, the device heavy in my hand. My heart skipped when I saw the screen. Unknown caller. The phone was ringing again. I stared at it for a long time, my pulse thudding in my ears. I knew what I had to do. I had to throw it away, to make it stop. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. It was as if something was pulling me toward it, pushing me to answer, to give in. I answered. You're still running, the voice said, calm as ever, like it had been waiting for me to pick up. I opened my mouth to scream, to say something, but nothing came out. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. The shadows were everywhere, creeping along the edges of my vision, crawling into the corners of my mind. It won't end. The voice didn't sound threatening now. It sounded pitying. Like it knew something I didn't. Like it knew how this would end. It won't end. The words repeated in my mind like an echo, a grim reminder of the inevitability of what was happening. There was no escape. There never had been. The phone clicked off. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. The street was empty, eerily silent. The houses around me looked hollow, their windows dark, lifeless. I felt like I had crossed into another world, one where time didn't exist, where the rules didn't apply. The world felt wrong, distorted. And then I heard it. The tapping. Not from the phone. Not from the walls. But from the ground beneath my feet. I froze. It wasn't just tapping now. It was a pounding, a rhythmic, relentless pounding, like something was beneath me, buried deep in the earth, trying to break free. The ground trembled, as if something enormous was moving below, something that didn't belong. I turned and ran, but the pounding followed me, louder and closer with every step. The noise was deafening now, vibrating through my bones. It wasn't just from the ground anymore. It was in the air, in the sky, everywhere. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. The sky above me was no longer blue. It was dark, swirling, as if something was tearing it apart. The clouds twisted into shapes, unnatural, grotesque, forming outlines of figures that seemed to watch me. They weren't clouds. They were something else, something waiting, watching, judging. I heard a voice again, but it wasn't from the phone. It was everywhere. Inside my head. It's time. I stopped running. I couldn't keep going. The world was falling apart around me, and I was powerless to stop it. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. Tall, thin, their forms stretched and shifting, barely human. They moved with unnatural grace, their limbs bending at impossible angles. Their eyes glowed faintly, but they didn't need to see. They didn't need to look, they could feel me. They knew I was here. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The presence of them, their cold, unblinking gaze, suffocated me. The air was thick with their malice, with their hunger. They were waiting for me to accept it, waiting for me to realize that it was all over, that I couldn't escape. I stumbled back, but the ground beneath me cracked open, revealing a dark abyss. The figures moved toward me, their movements fluid, too fast, too unnatural. They were closing in, surrounding me. I backed away from the edge, but the darkness was pulling at me, sucking me in, wrapping around my legs like chains. I couldn't fight it. And then, in the final moments before the darkness swallowed me whole, I heard it. The last thing I would ever hear. You were always one of us. The phone call ended, but it didn't matter anymore. The darkness claimed me, and it would never let me go. Have you ever felt like you were walking in circles, yet never once looked behind? That sense that, no matter how many steps you take, you never truly leave the place you started? It's the strangest feeling, like a soft pressure in your chest, as though the world is gently squeezing you into a space that gets smaller with every breath. I felt that pressure the moment I stepped into the botanical garden. I had heard about this place from a friend, someone who swore by its beauty and peacefulness. It's a perfect place for solitude, they said, a peaceful escape from everything. I wasn't particularly looking for solitude, but after a long week of work and a few restless nights, I thought I might give it a try. The idea of a calm walk among the flowers, with nothing but the sound of birds and wind, seemed inviting. The garden was just as serene as I imagined, lush, vibrant, and filled with the scent of fresh blooms. The paths were neatly paved, winding their way through the rows of colorful plants, each more exotic than the last. There were benches tucked away at quiet corners, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. It felt safe, comfortable. I started down one of the winding paths, my shoes crunching lightly against the gravel. The sun was high, casting a warm glow over the garden. For a moment, I almost felt like I could lose myself here, like the world outside couldn't touch me. I rounded a corner, drawn toward a particular cluster of violet flowers that seemed to glow against the green of the garden. But when I looked up, I was standing in the same place I had started. I frowned. There were no turns or branches, just the same flowers, the same path, the same bench. It was as if the garden had reset itself. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the peaceful effect of the place playing tricks on me. Perhaps I had been distracted and hadn't noticed a turn. I took a deep breath and walked again, this time focusing on the path ahead. But when I turned a corner, again, I was back at the same spot. It was different this time, though. The flowers, once a simple shade of violet, had deepened into a darker hue, almost black at the edges. The air had changed too, colder now, with an undertone of something strange. Something was wrong. I paused, my hand resting on the rough bark of a nearby tree. The silence felt heavier now, pressing in on me. I could hear a faint rustling sound, like footsteps in the distance, but when I looked, there was no one in sight. No birds, no people. Just the hum of the garden, as if it were holding its breath. Taking another breath, I retraced my steps, determined to find another way out. The garden was supposed to be a place of peace, not this eerie, unnatural feeling that was creeping into my chest. But as I walked, the path shifted again. The flowers that had been bright and welcoming were now twisted, their petals curled and sharp, like claws reaching for the sky. The path beneath me had turned darker, as if the gravel had been replaced with something slick and wet. My footsteps echoed louder now, unnaturally so, almost too loud for such a quiet place. I stopped again. Was this the same place? Or had the garden changed around me? I turned slowly, looking for something, anything, that would explain the growing sense of unease inside me. But there was nothing. No signs, no landmarks, nothing to indicate I had wandered off course. Everything looked exactly the same. I began to walk again, faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thicker, as if it were pressing down on me, suffocating me with its weight. I took another turn, hoping to find something familiar. But the path stretched out before me, endless, as if I were walking in a loop. Every corner led me back to the same place, the same twisted flowers, the same oppressive silence. I glanced over my shoulder, my pulse quickening. The garden felt alive. The plants, the trees, the very earth beneath me, it was all shifting, watching me. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. I had to get out. There had to be a way out. But no matter how many times I tried, no matter which direction I took, I always found myself back at the same spot. The same twisted garden. The same dark flowers. The silence began to press in on me again, louder now, filling the empty spaces with an unsettling hum. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the garden had swallowed me whole, leaving no room for escape. I was trapped. And the worst part? I didn't know how long I had been there. How long I had been walking in circles. The garden, it wasn't just a garden. It was something else. Something I couldn't escape. Something that had changed the moment I stepped inside. And now, it was waiting. I couldn't remember when the light started to fade. It had been gradual, like the garden was dimming its own sun, letting shadows stretch longer across the paths. The warmth of the afternoon had left me, replaced by a chill that nipped at my skin. Every corner I turned now seemed more suffocating, the air growing thicker, as though the atmosphere itself was closing in on me. I tried to keep moving, but my legs were heavy, like the ground beneath me was pulling me down. The weight of the silence pressed against my eardrums, but this time it wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like I was being watched by something unseen. I had to escape. I had to find a way out. I tried retracing my steps once more, hoping that if I followed the same path backward, I might finally stumble upon a way out of this maddening loop. But the more I walked, the more familiar everything became, until I could no longer tell if I had seen something before or if it was just the same, repeating scene. I stopped at a large stone arch, one I hadn't noticed before. It was covered in creeping ivy, its surface slick with moisture, and for a moment I thought I could hear something faint, a soft, murmured voice. But it wasn't like a normal sound. It was more of a vibration that rippled through my bones, reverberating deep within my chest. I stepped closer to the arch, squinting to see if there was something beyond it. The ivy shifted slightly as if pushed by an invisible hand, and I reached out without thinking, brushing the leaves aside. Behind the arch was a narrow path, narrower than any of the others. It curved sharply to the right, disappearing into darkness. Without hesitation, I stepped through, my shoes crunching against the wet ground. The moment I did, the atmosphere seemed to change. The garden had gone silent, not even a breeze moving through the trees. I could feel my heart pounding louder now, my breathing shallow and quick. The path was tighter here, the walls of plants closing in around me. The air smelled thick, almost sour, and I had the unnerving sensation that the leaves and flowers were too close, as though they were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I reached out to push through a thicket of tangled vines, but something caught my wrist. I pulled back quickly, feeling the sharpness of a thorn bite into my skin. I glanced down to see it, but the thorn wasn't there. I blinked, and when I looked again, my wrist was perfectly fine. The plants had been watching me, somehow. It was like they could sense my fear, could taste it in the air. My throat tightened. The idea of being watched wasn't new, at least, not in the usual sense. I had felt eyes on me before, many times in my life. But this wasn't like that. There was something more. Something wrong. As I stepped forward again, the ground beneath me shifted. The path twisted in a way that didn't make sense, like the earth itself had bent to fit the garden's design. I stepped to the side to avoid a large root sticking out of the ground, only to find myself facing the same arch again. The ivy-covered stones loomed before me, as if mocking me for my attempts to escape. The garden was playing tricks on me. I turned around, half expecting to see someone, or something, behind me. But there was nothing. Just the overgrown greenery, the silence, and the sense of being trapped. I tried to reason with myself. This had to be some kind of trick, right? A maze designed to make people lose their sense of direction. Some kind of psychological experiment, perhaps. Maybe the garden was just built this way. It didn't have to mean anything sinister. But even as I thought this, the air grew colder. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My breath began to fog in front of me, and I swore I could hear the faintest whisper, like a voice just at the edge of my hearing. I paused again, straining to listen. The whispering was softer now, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from any of the plants or the trees, it was coming from behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the same twisting paths and overgrown vines. I was alone. The whisper came again, only this time it was clearer. It wasn't words, but something like a soft hum, a sound that vibrated in the air, just beyond my comprehension. It was as though the garden itself was trying to communicate with me, but the meaning of the sound was beyond me. My chest tightened. This wasn't just a garden. I backed away from the arch, my shoes slipping on the wet path. The ground felt like it was subtly tilting beneath me, as though the garden itself was alive, and I was a part of some greater plan. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, filling the space. I turned, looking for the source, but the path kept shifting, the trees bending and swaying unnaturally. In the distance, I thought I saw movement. A shadow flitting between the trees. I wasn't alone. I broke into a run, panic bubbling up inside me. I couldn't just stand there. I needed to get out. The trees seemed to stretch taller now, their branches reaching for the sky like skeletal fingers. The path twisted and split, leading me in all directions, none of which made sense. I could feel the garden closing in on me, trapping me, suffocating me. It was as if the walls themselves were moving, shifting around me. And then, I saw it. At the end of the path, I saw a faint light. The first real light I had seen since entering the garden. I ran toward it, my heart racing, but the closer I got, the more it felt like the light was pulling me deeper into the labyrinth. The light wasn't comforting anymore, it was wrong. It glowed too brightly, too fiercely, like a flame too close to your face. I stopped just short of it, unable to take another step. Something inside me screamed to turn back, but I couldn't. The whispering had stopped. But in the stillness, I realized something. The garden wasn't a maze. It wasn't just a labyrinth of plants. It was a trap. And it had been waiting for me to walk in. It wasn't going to let me leave. The light flickered like a dying star. It pulsed, sending waves of unnatural warmth through the cold air around me. The garden was silent, too silent. The rustling of leaves, the hum of distant creatures, all had ceased, leaving only the soft, almost imperceptible throb of the glowing light. I stood frozen, staring at it, as if waiting for it to speak. I felt a pull on my chest, as though the garden itself was reaching inside me, tugging at something deep within, something primal. I had to get away from it. But my legs wouldn't move. It was like the ground had rooted me to the spot, like the garden had claimed me, and I was now part of it. The weight of that realization sank deep into my bones. I took a shaky breath and tried to tear my eyes away from the pulsing light. But there was something there. Something moving just beyond the light, shifting in the periphery of my vision. I squinted, trying to focus. The shape was subtle at first, just a dark shadow, blending with the trees. But it moved, quick and sudden, almost too fast for me to track. My heart skipped a beat. Was someone there? I whipped around, looking for any sign of another person, anything that could explain the feeling of being watched, the presence I couldn't shake. But the garden remained unchanged, the same twisted paths, the same overgrown plants. Only the faintest breeze stirred the leaves. Then, the shadow moved again. Closer this time. It darted from behind a thick patch of ivy, just out of the corner of my eye. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, slender, its shape indistinct in the dimming light. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it, the oppressive weight of its gaze. It was watching me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, my feet struggling to find traction on the uneven ground. But the path shifted again. It didn't matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. The same twisted trees and darkened path kept leading me back to that same spot. The garden was closing in. It was alive. I glanced toward the light again, wondering if I should go toward it, if it might offer a way out, or if it was just another part of the trap. But as I took a step toward it, something in the garden seemed to respond. The plants around me shivered, their leaves trembling as if alive, as if reacting to my movement. I stopped. I couldn't move any further. I couldn't breathe. The figure in the distance, the shadow that had been stalking me, stepped into the light. It was not a person. It was something else. Something that couldn't possibly belong to this world. Its form was not solid. It was made of shifting darkness, a tangle of limbs and shapes that defied logic, as if the very air around it bent and twisted to hold it together. It didn't have a face, or at least not one I could recognize. Just a black void where its features should have been, its presence more terrifying than any physical form. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to make my skin crawl. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the ground, paralyzed by the sight of it. The shadow's shape writhed, its tendrils stretching toward me, as if reaching for something buried deep inside me. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a feeling. A sensation that washed over me like ice-cold water. I could hear its voice in my head, and it was nothing like a human voice. It was the sound of 1,000 whispers, of ancient knowledge that no one was meant to know. You are mine now. The words didn't come from its mouth, but from the space between us, from the very air around me. The voice seemed to vibrate through my entire body, filling my chest with cold, empty space. I staggered back, fighting to breathe, but I couldn't. The air was thick, choking. Every step I took only brought me closer to the figure, closer to the thing that now had me in its grasp. But I couldn't see a way out. The garden was no longer a garden. It had become a prison, and the walls were closing in. I felt it then, something sharp, something cold, pressing against my chest. I looked down and saw the vines. The garden had grown even thicker, wrapping around my legs, my arms, tightening their hold on me. The flowers, once so beautiful, had become monstrous, their petals now sharp and jagged, like teeth. I tried to pull away, but the vines only tightened their grip, dragging me closer to the center of the garden. I could hear them whispering now, the flowers and leaves and vines all calling to me in a language I couldn't understand, but that felt wrong. It was a language of hunger, of consumption. And then I saw it, at the center of the garden, past the twisting vines and the suffocating flowers, there was a dark pit. The ground around it was black, scorched, as if the earth itself had been burned away. The figure was moving toward it, dragging me along. I had no choice but to follow. But I couldn't see an escape. The pit was waiting. And the garden knew I was there. It was alive. It had been waiting for me to step into its grasp. And now, it was pulling me toward the dark center, toward its endless hunger. I tried to scream again, but there was no sound. Just the whisper of the garden, growing louder, surrounding me. You are mine now. The darkness in front of me swallowed everything. It was a suffocating black void, like the mouth of some vast, unholy creature. I felt my body being pulled toward it, my legs struggling to keep me upright, my hands grasping at the thick vines that now covered the ground. But they were too strong, too tight, pulling me closer, inch by inch. The shadow was behind me, looming closer, its presence suffocating. I could feel it breathing down my neck, the dark tendrils of its form curling around my thoughts. It was still there, waiting for me to give in, to break, and let it take everything I was. The garden around me twisted in on itself. The air, once filled with the fragrance of flowers, was now heavy with rot. The scent of decay was overpowering, clinging to the edges of my throat like poison. I looked back at the path I had just come from, but it was gone. The winding trails that had once seemed so inviting were now lost, replaced by an endless loop of the same twisted trees, the same distorted flowers. It was as if I had never moved at all, as if I had been walking in circles from the very beginning. Each step I took felt like a betrayal of my body, a refusal to acknowledge the growing reality that there was no escape. The vines pulled harder, dragging me toward the center of the garden. With every inch I was dragged, the ground beneath me seemed to warp and shift. The stone paths became slick with moss, the trees now seemed to lean in, their branches reaching toward me like fingers, desperate to hold me in place. Then I heard it, the sound of whispers. They were faint at first, but then they grew louder, a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. The sound was too many things at once. It was a hum, or rustle of leaves, a low murmur that clawed at my mind. "Welcome," they said. The words weren't in any language I knew. They were just felt. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. I stumbled as the ground beneath me seemed to shift again, pulling me in all directions, the path splitting and reforming with every step. The sky overhead had begun to darken, the clouds swirling, twisting in unnatural patterns. The whole garden had become a reflection of my mind, warped, broken, and losing itself in the spirals of my panic. "You are mine now." The voice came again, and this time it felt like the entire garden was speaking in unison. My head spun, my thoughts fragmented. What had begun as a peaceful visit had turned into something far worse, a nightmare that no waking could break free from. The vines were pulling me into the center of the garden, where that black pit waited like a maw that would swallow me whole. I fought against the pull. My hand scraped against the rough bark of a nearby tree, trying to hold myself in place, trying to find some purchase. But the branches bent back, forcing my hands off them, and the vines tightened their grip, almost lovingly. I looked up. The shadow figure was closer now. Its form was flickering, no longer shifting. It was stable, solid, and its presence was overwhelming. It had grown larger, towering over me, its tendrils reaching down like monstrous arms. The figure didn't need to move anymore. Its very presence filled the garden, suffocating everything else. I knew that it wasn't just waiting for me. It was expecting me. This was the moment. Suddenly, the ground beneath me cracked open, and I could feel the garden's heartbeat, the deep, thudding pulse of something ancient, something that existed far before the earth itself. The pit before me was now wide open, a dark abyss that seemed to extend into infinity. And from the pit, something moved. A shadow, much larger than the figure, began to rise from the depths. It was a ripple in the very air, a distortion, an evil that had no form, no end. My breath caught in my throat. The garden had fed it. It had always been here. I had thought the garden was a maze, but now I realized it wasn't a maze. It was a living thing. A creature, a prison, and the walls were closing in. The vines around me released their grip, but I wasn't free. No, my legs were now moving without my control, dragged by something else. The garden had chosen for me, and there was no escaping the path now. The shadow moved closer, filling my vision, and I could feel it inside my mind. It knew me. It knew my deepest thoughts, my worst fears. And then I saw the truth. The garden wasn't just pulling me in. It was pulling everything in. The land, the trees, the air, they were all part of it, all consumed by the hunger of the pit at the center of it all. I was just another offering. I reached forward, clawing at the dirt, at the walls of the pit, but it was useless. The vines wrapped around me again, this time pulling me toward the darkness. My body twisted, the ground beneath me giving way as the pit opened wide. I closed my eyes, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. And then I fell. When I awoke, the world was quiet. Too quiet. I lay on the ground, gasping for air, my body shaking with fear I could not shake off. Slowly, I opened my eyes. I was no longer in the garden. The pit, the shadow, the vines, they were gone. Instead, I found myself lying on a soft patch of grass, the sun shining down as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The air felt heavier now, colder. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. I scrambled to my feet, my legs weak, my head spinning. The garden was gone, but its presence still lingered, like a dark stain on my mind. I took a step forward, but then stopped. I realized with a shock I was back at the entrance to the garden. The same path. The same trees. The same twisted flowers. The gate stood before me, wide open. And yet, I knew it wasn't over. The garden had let me go, but it would never truly release me. Its roots had burrowed deep into my mind, its whispers echoing in the silence. And I could feel it, the hunger that never ceased. The garden would always be there, waiting. I took a few steps backward, my heart racing in my chest. The air felt wrong, as if the entire world around me had been shifted, subtly but irreversibly, out of alignment. The sunlight, though warm, seemed to be dimming, the shadows of the trees stretching unnaturally long across the ground. I turned quickly, glancing over my shoulder to see if the gate behind me had closed, or if anything, had changed. But it was as it had always been, a mere passageway leading into the garden. The eerie stillness of the place made my skin crawl. Was it real? Had everything I experienced in the garden truly happened, or had it been some kind of nightmare? My mind raced with questions, none of them offering any comfort. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever force had trapped me there was still watching me, still waiting for me to make the wrong move. I hesitated at the gate. My hand reached out, trembling as it hovered just inches from the rusted bars. I had felt the overwhelming presence of the garden, its pulse vibrating through the very air, its hunger seeping into me like poison. The walls, the vines, the whispering voices, all of it felt so tangible, like I had never truly left. The question gnawed at me, had the garden really let me go? I turned and looked over the entire length of the familiar path that led into the heart of the garden. The trees, with their twisted limbs and unnatural curvature, seemed to beckon me back. It was as if they recognized me, as if they were inviting me to return, to follow the same path again, down into the abyss where time had no meaning. But I couldn't. I refused to. I would never go back there. Yet as I stood there, frozen in indecision, the garden began to change once more. Slowly at first, the flowers near the entrance shifted, petals curling inward, their colors darkening, turning black. The air around me grew colder, the wind picking up, but there was no breeze, only the sound of a soft rustling, like whispers that I couldn't escape. And then, in the distance, I saw it, movement. Something, or someone, was moving inside the garden. A shape, darker than the trees, moving between the rows of vines. My breath hitched in my throat, and my feet felt as though they were glued to the earth beneath me. I had to leave. I spun around, determined to escape the grip of that place once and for all. But as I turned, I found myself face to face with a figure. It was tall, shrouded in shadows, with its body indistinct, almost as if it were a part of the darkness itself. I staggered back, my pulse pounding in my ears, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, silent and still, watching me. It felt familiar, too familiar, and as I squinted, trying to make out its features, my stomach dropped. No, it couldn't be. But there was no denying it. The figure before me was me. The same face, the same eyes, but with something wrong. The eyes, my eyes, were hollow, black like the void, staring at me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. The lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach the eyes, a smile that seemed to mock me, to know my every fear, my every thought. I opened my mouth to scream, but the words caught in my throat. My breath was shallow, panic clawing at my chest as I tried to step back. The figure, my reflection, my shadow, stepped forward. The earth trembled beneath its feet, a low rumble vibrating through the ground, and I could feel the air thickening with a pressure that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You never left," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own, twisted and hollow. The words seemed to cut through the air, reverberating in my chest like a drumbeat. I stumbled back, my legs failing to hold me up, and I collapsed to the ground, my heart racing, my mind reeling. The reflection of myself stepped closer, its shadow swallowing the ground around it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was all too much. The garden was still there, behind me, pulsing, breathing, waiting. I realized then, with a horrifying clarity, that I had never truly escaped. The garden was a part of me. It had always been a part of me. And I had been a part of it. As the shadowed figure loomed over me, I felt my thoughts start to blur, the line between reality and nightmare fading until nothing remained but the dark void that called to me. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that swirled around me. The garden had never let go. It was still here, still a part of me, and it always would be. There would be no escape. And the garden would never stop calling. I never thought it could happen to me. How could it? It's just a car, right? I should have known better. It was late at night, the roads empty, and I had been driving for hours. But when I noticed the steering wheel slipping from my grip and the gas pedal resisting every push, I knew something was wrong. Have you ever had that feeling when you realize something is not right, but you can't pinpoint what exactly is happening? It starts as a slight shift, something so small that you brush it off, telling yourself it's just your imagination. But then, when it becomes undeniable, when it hits you, it's too late. I was on the highway, alone, miles away from the nearest exit. The hum of the engine was almost soothing, but there was a sense of unease settling over me. The moonlight gleamed off the empty stretch of road ahead, and everything seemed normal. Too normal. But then, I noticed it. The car wasn't stopping. I tried to hit the brakes, my foot slamming down hard. Nothing. The pedal felt like it was stuck to the floor. I looked around, the headlights cutting through the dark, but there was nothing. Not a single car on the road. Just endless asphalt stretching before me. I checked my rearview mirror. The road behind was completely clear. Still, the car kept moving forward, its speed creeping up. I glanced at the dashboard. My speed was climbing faster than I could control. 30. 40. 50. I could feel my breath quicken, and the air in the car seemed to thicken, like I was suffocating. Why is this happening? The thought buzzed in my head. I tried turning the wheel, but it didn't respond. The engine roared louder now, as though urging me to go faster. I forced my hands to grip the wheel tighter, but the car kept its course, pulling me forward against my will. What do I do? I tried to calm myself, focusing on the empty road ahead. But then, just as I thought I could regain control, it happened. The road ahead, it wasn't just empty anymore. A figure appeared on the horizon. Slowly at first, just a dark shape in the distance. But as I approached, it became clearer, a figure standing alone on the side of the road. It was just a silhouette, too far away to make out clearly. But something about it unnerved me. I tried to slam my foot on the brake again, but it didn't respond. The car surged forward, as if it had its own mind. I wasn't in control anymore. The figure grew closer, and my heart began to race. I was hurtling toward it, but I couldn't stop. The car seemed to want to reach it. As I got closer, I could make out more details. A figure in dark clothing. And then, the sign. A broken, withered sign was planted next to the figure. The wind was so still that I could hear the faint creak of the metal. I leaned forward, my breath held tight in my chest. The sign, it had my name on it. It was a name I hadn't seen in years. a name that had no business being there. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, and my hands trembled on the wheel. My eyes darted between the sign and the figure, who still stood unmoving in the distance. Was this some sort of joke? Some twisted coincidence? But I couldn't afford to waste time thinking. I was still speeding toward that place, my body rigid with fear. The figure hadn't moved, and neither had the sign. Everything was still, too still. I was mere moments away from hitting it when I realized something. The car, it had stopped accelerating. It wasn't slowing down, but it wasn't speeding up anymore either. It was as if the road itself had become a trap, locking me into its course. My foot was still pressing down on the brake pedal, but it was useless. I was going to hit that sign. And then, without warning, the car came to a sudden halt. I froze, wide-eyed and gasping for air. The engine sputtered, and the headlights flickered before shutting off completely, leaving me in the pitch darkness. My hands were still gripped tightly on the steering wheel, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Outside, the figure was still there. It hadn't moved, and neither had the sign. I could feel a cold, biting wind picking up around me, though there was no visible source for it. The sound of the wind carried the faintest whispers. I tried to ignore them, to push them out of my mind. But then came the last thing I needed to hear. The faint creak of footsteps, heavy footsteps, coming toward the car. And then a voice. Deep, distorted. I've been waiting for you. I froze. My heart slammed against my chest, as if trying to escape. The voice, though faint, reverberated inside my skull. It was too clear to be mistaken for wind or imagination. I've been waiting for you. The voice felt familiar, but wrong. It was distorted, like it came from somewhere deep within the car, from something I couldn't see. I turned to the rearview mirror, but it reflected nothing but darkness. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound, the rest of the world swallowed by an eerie silence. Who is this? What do you want? I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted. The footsteps grew louder, closer now, and there was no mistaking that someone, or something, was walking toward me. The figure. The sign. The impossible stillness. It all felt wrong. I slowly turned my head back to the front, eyes wide, scanning the dark road ahead. The figure hadn't moved. But the footsteps, they were closer. Too close. I could feel them, hear them now, just outside my door. Then, with a sudden jolt, I realized I wasn't alone in the car. I didn't know how I knew, but I felt the presence. Something was inside of me. I could feel the air in the car shift, thicker, colder, as though the walls themselves were closing in. My skin prickled with an unnatural chill. A shadow seemed to loom next to me, though when I looked, nothing was there. Then, as the footsteps drew nearer, I heard a whisper, low and guttural, coming from beside me. You're going nowhere. The words sent a shock of panic through me. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking. The figure had to be outside. Maybe there was a way to escape. But the door wouldn't open. The handle was stuck, frozen as if it had been welded shut. I yanked again, harder this time, but it didn't budge. My eyes darted to the dashboard, the air heavy with dread. I needed to get out. I needed to move. But the car wouldn't let me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something flash by, a movement too fast for me to catch, but enough to make my blood run cold. It was like a shadow slipping past the window, too quick, too deliberate. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the silence of the night. And then, the voice again, low and unmistakable. "Look at the sign." I didn't want to. I didn't want to look. But my head turned on its own, as if something inside me was forcing me to obey. The sign, still standing, its weathered edges swaying in the wind, seemed to beckon me. I stared at it, heart hammering in my chest. My name was still there, clear as day. But now, under the dim glow of the headlights, I saw something else. A line had been added to the sign, carved deeply into the wood. "You will never leave." The words burned into my mind, searing through my thoughts like a warning, a promise, a curse. I tried to look away, but my gaze remained locked, as though something was holding me in place. I felt the air grow colder, the darkness more oppressive. What is happening to me? I slammed my foot down on the brake once more, but nothing changed. The car didn't budge. It was like it was part of the road, part of the trap, a piece of this strange, twisted puzzle. The figure was still there, its shape dark and unmoving, as though watching, waiting. The whispers came again, soft at first, like a distant murmur in the wind. But they grew louder, and then more clear. "It's too late." The sound of the engine sputtered, then went dead. The car was now completely silent, the headlights flickering one last time before they too went dark. The world around me was plunged into an oppressive blackness. I knew, then, I wasn't meant to leave. I wasn't going anywhere. A cold, creeping dread washed over me as I finally understood the truth. This wasn't a broken car. This wasn't a mistake. This was something else. Something much worse. The road, the sign, the figure, they weren't random. They were part of a design, an inescapable trap. And I was stuck in it. I wanted to scream, to break free, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only sit there, paralyzed by fear, as the shadows closed in around me. In the distance, I could hear it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, growing closer, louder, faster. It was coming for me, and I was trapped. The darkness outside the car seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing everything. I tried to steady my breathing, to calm myself, but it was impossible. My chest felt tight, like a vice was slowly crushing me from the inside. The sound of footsteps grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was the presence. I could feel it, like a heavy weight pressing against me from all sides, closing in. I looked at the rearview mirror, desperate for any sign of escape. The empty road behind me was as lifeless as the one in front, but that didn't matter. The presence wasn't from the outside. It was here, with me, in the car. I shifted in my seat, my hands gripping the wheel with a force I didn't even know I had. The car felt more like a cage now, its interior too small, too suffocating. I needed to think, to do something. The engine was dead, the lights were off. Nothing in the car worked. I could feel the cold creeping in, seeping into my bones. A shadow passed by the window, too quick to fully catch, but enough to make my heart race again. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. Nothing. The car didn't respond. It was as though the vehicle was simply an extension of the strange force around me, a force that was slowly, but surely, taking control. I'm not alone. The thought flickered in my mind, but it was immediately followed by something far worse. It's waiting. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heart pounding, each beat like a drum in the heavy quiet. My eyes darted to the mirror once more, but there was still nothing, no sign of who or what was out there. The air in the car had thickened, and I could taste the metallic tang of fear in my mouth. And then, a voice. It wasn't the voice from earlier, the distorted one. This one was calm, almost too calm, and it came from inside the car. "You can't run." My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a whisper. It was a presence in my mind, one that felt like it had always been there, like it had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. My skin crawled as I slowly turned my head, as though to prove to myself that I wasn't hearing things. Nothing. Nothing at all. The car was empty. "It's waiting, you know." I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the door handle again, but my fingers were too numb to even grip it. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How did I get here? How was this happening? The world outside seemed to stretch, its edges warping. The sign, the footsteps, the voice, it was all connected, but I couldn't see the full picture. My head felt foggy, like the very air I breathed was clouding my thoughts. I pulled at the seatbelt with shaking hands, trying to free myself, to escape. It wouldn't come undone. The leather straps were now tied around my chest, constricting with every breath I took. I looked out the window again. This time, the figure was closer. A tall silhouette, standing motionless in the middle of the road. I could feel its presence even from behind the glass, could sense its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The figure wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its shape was wrong, distorted, like something trying to look like a person but failing. I could see no face, no features, just darkness, a shape that shifted as if it were made of shadows, flickering with every movement. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. But no answer came. Only the whisper, low and steady, filling the car, wrapping around me like a chain. "You're already gone." I slammed my hands onto the dashboard, feeling the cold plastic bite into my skin. The feeling of being trapped, of being claimed, was too much. I had to get out. I had to do something. Anything. But it was no use. The presence in the car was growing stronger, pressing on me, seeping into my thoughts, drowning me in its weight. There was no escape. "You won't leave." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. The car shifted, lurching forward as if it was in control, not me. I had no power here. I was nothing but a passenger, a spectator in my own body, my own mind. The figure moved again. I could see it more clearly now, its shape shifting in a way that was unnatural, too fluid. It wasn't walking, not in the way a person should. It was gliding, its form elongating and distorting with every step it took, coming closer, closer. I reached for the door again, my body trembling in terror, but it was still locked. The window wouldn't roll down, and the steering wheel was frozen in place, as if the car itself had decided I would never leave. And then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had begun, they stopped. The figure was right outside my window, its form now only inches away from me, a black mass that filled my vision. I could feel its coldness seeping through the glass, chilling my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow pressed closer. And then, in a voice so cold it sent shivers down my spine, it spoke again. "It's too late to turn back." And the car began to move. The car sped up again, far too quickly for my mind to process. I felt the seat press against my back as the vehicle hurtled down the empty road, faster than I should have been able to control. The wheel remained unmoving beneath my hands, as if it had become a part of something greater, something that didn't need me anymore. The presence outside, the figure, it was closer now, and I could feel its coldness seeping through the car, making the air inside seem impossibly thin. I glanced out the window. The figure was now standing just beside me, inches away, its form flickering in the dim light of the dashboard. It was still shapeless, still wrong, as if it wasn't even a thing, but a force, a dark, unsettling force that had wrapped itself around me, pulling me deeper into its web. I slammed my foot onto the brake again, hoping for some semblance of control, but it was useless. The car refused to slow down, the brakes offering no resistance. The sound of the engine revving loudly, growing louder with each passing second, made my pulse race even faster. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. "Please, stop." But it didn't stop. It wasn't going to. I could feel the presence growing stronger, surrounding me, pulling tighter with every second I remained trapped inside. The voice from before, the one that had whispered in my ear, echoed in my mind once again. "You're already part of it." My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle once more, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped in this cursed vehicle, and the figure was still there, still watching, still waiting. I was no longer sure if it was a man or something else entirely. Its shape was impossible to define, its movement alien to anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't even truly walking, it was sliding like liquid shadows, undulating with every shift of its form. I turned my head, desperate to look away from the window, but there was no escape. No matter how much I tried to divert my attention, I could feel its presence invading my thoughts, drowning me. Its touch, cold, unrelenting, was all around me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The weight in the air was suffocating. The car was no longer mine to control, and I realized with terrifying clarity that nothing in this moment was. "It's waiting," the voice said, this time from inside the car again. It was so close, I could feel it in my bones. "Waiting for you." I twisted my body in the seat, turning toward the back. But the rearview mirror was empty. The road stretched endlessly behind me, empty and dark. But the voice, this voice, cold and hollow, came again. "You will understand soon." I wanted to scream, to beg for help, to do anything that could end this madness. But there was no one. There was no one here but me, the car, and the figure outside. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and I felt my mind slipping. The darkness seemed to consume everything, the road, the air, even my thoughts. I could no longer tell where the car was heading. I couldn't even recall which direction I'd been driving in. Everything felt wrong. The world felt wrong. The figure outside seemed to grow larger. It was pressing closer to the window, its form merging with the shadows, becoming one with the darkness. It was no longer just standing by the side of the car, it was on the car, sliding along the roof, its movements unnatural, too fluid, as if it were alive and yet not alive at all. I screamed this time. A raw, desperate cry that felt like it came from the very depths of my soul. But it didn't help. The car began to turn, the wheel twisting in my hands, as if it had its own mind now, pulling me down a path I hadn't chosen. The lights of the dashboard flickered, casting strange, fleeting shadows across my face, as though the car itself was alive, feeding on my fear. And then, Just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it was gone. The car jerked to a halt. The tires screeched in protest, the brakes finally engaging with a deafening sound, and the engine sputtered, dying completely. I was still sitting in the driver's seat, my heart hammering in my chest, my hands still clenched around the wheel. The silence was crushing. I looked around frantically, searching for any sign of the figure, any trace of its unnatural presence, but the road was empty. The night was still. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. I had to get out. I had to leave, to escape this nightmare that had wrapped itself around me. But I couldn't move. I couldn't leave the car. Something was keeping me here. I turned my head to the side, my eyes locking on the lone, weathered sign by the side of the road. The one that hadn't been there before. My name was written on it. Just my name. The feeling of terror surged again, a flood of panic rising in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. The sign, it was the same as the one from my dream. The one that had warned me, the one that had known I would be here. It was waiting. And now, I was part of it. I couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick, as though the atmosphere itself had conspired to make it impossible for me to move, to think. My eyes locked onto the sign, still shaking in disbelief. My name was etched into it, each letter as clear as the panic pounding in my chest. It felt wrong. Like it shouldn't have been there, yet it was. I reached for the door handle, but before my fingers could touch it, a soft sound broke the silence, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They weren't coming from the road, but from behind me, from inside the car. I froze. The sound grew louder with each passing second, like a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. A sound too deliberate, too alive to be natural. My heart skipped, and I could feel my pulse in my throat, a constant, sickening thrum that echoed the steps. I had to leave. I had to get out of the car. But my body refused to respond. Every instinct screamed at me to move, yet I couldn't. My limbs felt paralyzed, like invisible chains had wrapped themselves around me, holding me captive in this metal cage. It's waiting for you. The voice again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper in my head. It was in the car with me, clear as day, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned my head slowly, my body screaming in resistance. The rearview mirror reflected nothing but darkness, but I felt the presence there, behind me, close enough that I could almost feel the coldness emanating from it. I blinked, and the reflection in the mirror changed. The darkness was no longer empty. There, in the glass, I saw a figure. A shadow. It was there, standing behind me, its face just out of view. It had no eyes. Just a black void where its face should have been. A ragged, hollow shape that seemed to be growing, expanding, its silhouette stretching beyond the limits of the mirror. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. The air inside the car grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging up the window. The figure shifted, its movements unnervingly slow, almost as though it was savoring my fear. You are part of this now, it whispered again, its voice slithering into my ears, sliding beneath my skin. You can't leave. The words hit me like a physical blow. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but I couldn't. The world outside the window blurred, the road stretching infinitely in front of me, an endless loop that felt more like a trap with every passing second. The car suddenly jerked, as though something had grabbed it from underneath. The wheels screeched against the pavement, the engine revving back to life on its own, forcing me to grip the wheel to stop from being thrown forward. The presence was everywhere now, filling the car, pushing in from all sides. The figure, still in the mirror, was no longer just a reflection. It was there with me. I could feel its cold breath, chilling the back of my neck, pressing against me. It didn't belong in this space. It didn't belong anywhere. The car accelerated on its own again. This time, faster. I slammed my foot down onto the brake, but it didn't matter. The pedal didn't respond. The wheel twisted out of my control. I was just a passenger in a car that was no longer mine to drive. The figure was inside the car now. I turned my head to face the back seat. It was there, its form indistinguishable from the shadows that had overtaken the car. It was tall, taller than any man should be, and its limbs stretched unnaturally long, bending in ways that weren't human. Its presence was suffocating, the air thick with a coldness that made every breath feel like I was inhaling ice. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice crawling under my skin, settling in the deepest corners of my mind. "You're already here." My pulse raced. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, and my hands gripped the wheel tighter, but I knew it was futile. I was trapped. The road had become endless. The world had become endless. I glanced to the side again, toward the sign. It hadn't changed. My name remained there, as if written in stone. It felt as if the sign was a part of the car now, a symbol of this twisted fate. A reminder that I was bound to this place, to this moment, forever. The car lurched again, and I nearly lost control as it swerved to the left, pulling me off the main road. The tires screamed in protest as they bit into the gravel, but the car kept moving, as though it had a mind of its own. I didn't know what was happening anymore. The figure in the back seat was watching me now, its hollow, formless eyes locked onto mine. I could see it twitching, its limbs jerking erratically as it moved closer, closer, inch by inch. "Don't look away," it whispered, its voice scratching at my eardrums, raw and guttural. "It's too late now." The road ahead twisted, a curve so sharp that it made my stomach lurch. I slammed my foot down, but the brakes didn't respond. The car was moving faster, the engine growling like a beast. The figure was closer now, hovering just behind me. The car hit the curve. Time seemed to freeze as the vehicle screamed around the bend, and I saw it, off in the distance, another sign, this one new and unfamiliar. But as the headlights flickered on it, my heart sank. The sign wasn't new. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same one from before. The one with my name. I was trapped in an endless loop, and I was only getting closer to it. The car swerved wildly again, and I closed my eyes, bracing for impact. The world seemed to spin in slow motion as the car careened out of control. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, but it didn't matter. The car was no longer mine to command. The road, once familiar and safe, now twisted and contorted into a maze of sharp turns, each one leading me further into the unknown. The sign, my name, it was always ahead of me. No matter which direction I went, it was there, mocking me, reminding me of my helplessness. I braced for the crash, my body tensed in anticipation of the impact. But instead of the violent jolt I expected, the car stopped. Suddenly, as if something had gently placed it on the side of the road. The engine hummed softly, the car completely still. No screeching tires, no shuddering metal. It was as if the car had never moved at all. I opened my eyes, heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see the end, but instead, there was silence. The air was thick with it. And the sign, it was gone. My name no longer gleamed on the rusted metal. The road stretched ahead, quiet, empty, almost peaceful. I exhaled in relief, the tension in my body melting away. I was alive. The nightmare had ended. The figure in the back seat, the cold presence, it was gone. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. But then, I heard it again. A voice, faint but unmistakable. "You think you're free." It whispered from the darkness, and I felt the chill of its words seep into my bones. My head snapped to the rearview mirror. Nothing. No figure. But I felt it. I felt the presence, cold and suffocating, wrapping around me like a vice. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, but the car remained still. I twisted the key in the ignition, but it didn't turn. The engine was off, yet the car wouldn't budge. The silence deepened. I could hear the wind outside, faint rustling of leaves, but there was something else now. Something under the natural sounds. A faint tapping. I turned my head slowly, unable to stop myself. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. The figure was back. Not in the seat, not behind me, but in the reflection, standing at the edge of the road, just outside the car. It was watching me. Its form was still a twisted shadow, but this time, its face, or what could be called a face, was clearer. It was a hollow, gaping void where eyes should have been, a mouth stretched in a silent scream. It wasn't moving, but it was there, more real than ever. I could see the faint outline of its limbs, stretched impossibly long, bending in ways they shouldn't. The shadows were alive. "You will never leave," it said, its voice echoing in my skull, louder now, shaking the very air. I wanted to scream, to shout, to fight. But my voice, it wouldn't come. My body was paralyzed again, every part of me frozen in terror. The car started moving again. Slowly at first, as if it were testing me, but then faster, the engine growling back to life on its own. The road stretched out endlessly before me, winding and twisting. The sign, it was back. Again. I couldn't see the end. I couldn't see anything but the road ahead, the shadows creeping in from the corners of my vision. This was no longer a nightmare. This was reality. The car was my prison. The road was my fate. And the figure in the mirror, it was the only thing that had power over me now. The engine roared louder, the speed increasing with each passing second, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I was no longer driving. I was just along for the ride. And there was no way out. The road continued to stretch, and I could feel the figure drawing closer. There would be no escape. I wonder, have you ever thought about what happens when you look into the mirror and feel like you're being watched? But not by you. What if, just for a second, something inside that reflection moves differently than you do? That was the question I couldn't shake. It started one evening, just like any other, when I stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my hair. The light was soft, the house was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. I leaned in to get a closer look at the strands, but as I did, something strange caught my eye. My reflection wasn't exactly the same as I was. It was subtle at first. A flicker, a slight movement, as though my reflection had hesitated just for a second while I continued brushing. I blinked and looked again. No, there it was again. My reflection was smiling. But I wasn't. not even close. I stopped brushing, my fingers stiff against the handle. My breath caught in my chest. For a moment, I just stared, not moving, too afraid to move. The smile in the mirror slowly faded, and it looked wrong. A twist of the lips, just enough to make me uneasy, like it wasn't mine. I turned away from the mirror and tried to brush off the feeling. I convinced myself it was just tiredness or the light playing tricks on my eyes. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The next few days, it happened again. Not every time I looked, but enough to unsettle me. Little things, like my reflection moving a fraction of a second too late, or a hand lifting when mine didn't. But there was one instance that changed everything. It was the morning. I had just woken up, my hair tangled and messy, and I stumbled into the bathroom. Half asleep, I didn't even notice the mirror at first. But when I caught sight of myself, I froze. There I was, standing with the towel wrapped around my body, but my reflection was still in the middle of turning away from the sink. It wasn't just delayed this time, it was as if it wasn't even me that moved. I reached out toward the mirror, my fingers brushing the cool surface. As I did, I felt it, the coldness on the back of my neck. My reflection smiled again, but it wasn't my smile. It was something dark, too wide. And that's when I saw it. Behind me, in the reflection, there was a figure. It wasn't me. It was someone, no, something, lurking behind me. The thing in the mirror moved closer, its eyes wide, empty, its mouth opening as if to speak, but there was no sound. I spun around quickly, heart racing, expecting to find nothing. But there was nothing. Just the silent, still air of the bathroom. I turned back to the mirror. My reflection was normal now. But my pulse didn't slow down. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. I tried to ignore it. I couldn't, but I forced myself to. I told myself it was just stress, or maybe a trick of the light. That's when I noticed it. The crack. I hadn't seen it the night before, but there it was, stretching across the glass, a thin, jagged line running from the top corner all the way down to the bottom. I didn't remember breaking it. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But something held me there. A pull, deep inside me, urging me to stay, to watch the mirror. To see if I'd finally understand what was happening. And then it moved again. My reflection, no, it wasn't mine. It was walking toward the edge of the mirror, its movements now sharp, jerky, not in sync with my own. And when it reached the edge, it turned, facing me head on. And that's when I realized I wasn't the one looking anymore. It was looking at me. I stepped back, my feet unsteady on the cold tile, and that's when I heard it. The sound. A whisper, barely audible. Just a word, spoken through the glass. Come in. I didn't understand it. My heart raced, and I backed away from the mirror, almost stumbling over my own feet. My mind screamed for me to run, to leave the bathroom and never come back. But my eyes couldn't look away. The mirror seemed different. It was pulling me in, like it was alive. I could see something else, another world, beyond the glass, shifting, dark and indistinct, but it was there. I felt it. And before I knew it, the crack in the mirror began to spread. It split open wider, as if the glass itself was being pulled apart. My reflection began to move closer, and I felt something cold, like fingers, brush against my skin from the other side. I wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped inside me. There was no escape. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest. The cold fingers from the mirror still tingled on my skin. It felt like a nightmare, but I couldn't wake up. The crack in the mirror spread faster now, growing like an ominous web. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt frozen to the spot. The reflection, that thing that wasn't me, stepped forward. The air around me grew heavier, colder, as if the entire room had suddenly been submerged underwater. The space between me and the mirror seemed to stretch, like the world itself had been distorted. "Come in." The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was unmistakably human. The words felt like they were pulling at me, wrapping around me, like invisible threads trying to drag me toward the glass. My body ached to obey, but my mind fought against it. I took a step back, the tiles beneath my feet slick with sweat. My reflection was still there, but it wasn't just standing still anymore. It was moving, pacing, as though it were waiting for me to make my move. The eyes of that thing, my reflection, never left me. They were dark, hollow, and empty, but they saw me. And worse, they knew me. I turned away from the mirror, my breath shallow and rapid. The bathroom felt smaller now, the walls closing in around me. The hum of the lights overhead was louder than it should have been. It felt like the air itself was thicker, harder to breathe. I needed to get out. I didn't care if it was just the bathroom or the entire house, anything to get away from that thing. But as I reached for the door handle, something caught my eye. A movement. A figure standing in the hallway outside the bathroom, just beyond the cracked door. I froze. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was there, standing perfectly still, watching me. But it wasn't me. It was someone else. Their form was dark and indistinct, but their posture was unmistakable, rigid, like they were waiting for me to acknowledge them. My reflection was now in the hallway with me. The glass wasn't just holding my image, it was becoming my reality. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking as I gripped the doorframe. What was happening to me? Why couldn't I escape? Suddenly, the whispering voice returned. "Come closer." I glanced back at the mirror, my heart dropping into my stomach. The reflection, the other me, was now standing at the edge of the mirror, staring directly at me, its expression cold and empty. My reflection reached out a hand, its fingers stretching toward me, pressing against the cracked surface. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut. The sound of the wood against the frame echoed through the house, but the tension didn't lift. If anything, it grew stronger. I felt trapped. There was no escape from the thing in the mirror. It had followed me. The house felt wrong now. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, everything seemed distorted, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I rushed to the living room, my thoughts a mess, my body still trembling. But when I glanced back down the hallway, I saw something that sent a wave of icy dread through me. The reflection was no longer just in the bathroom. It was in the hallway, on the walls, on the floor. It was everywhere. The mirror wasn't confined to the glass anymore. It was spilling into my world, taking over, until it was all I could see. I ran. I don't know where to, but I needed to get out of the house. I rushed through the front door, into the cold night air. The wind bit at my skin, and the stars above looked distant, indifferent. But even outside, I couldn't escape it. The mirror's presence lingered. I could feel it. Even without the reflection, I could sense it, somewhere, just beyond the edge of my vision, watching. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe, to steady myself. But as I opened them again, I realized something terrible. The reflection wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was in me. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, suffocating me. I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to calm the rising panic, but it didn't help. The sensation that something was watching me, lurking just beyond my awareness, made it impossible to focus. I stumbled backward across the yard, my eyes darting to the windows of the house behind me. The reflection wasn't in the glass anymore, it had followed me outside. The world around me felt different, as if the air had changed, thickened, like I was trapped in a dream that I couldn't wake up from. I turned away from the house, needing to escape, needing to break free from whatever this was. My feet carried me down the street, but I didn't know where I was going. The night felt endless, the streets unfamiliar, even though I had walked them 1,000 times before. I looked around, searching for some sign of normalcy, but everything felt distorted. The shadows between the trees stretched too long, and the streetlights flickered as though they were struggling to stay on. The sounds of the city seemed muffled, like they were coming from miles away. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for me. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. In the reflection of a nearby store window, I saw myself, but not really. It was her, the other me. She was standing in the window, staring back at me with that same cold, empty gaze. But she wasn't mimicking me this time. She moved. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. In the reflection, she stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, until she was inches away from the glass. But I hadn't moved. I hadn't stepped closer. I hadn't done anything. I whipped around, searching the street behind me. There was no one there. Nothing. I looked back at the window. She was still there, standing just out of reach, but her movements were slow, unnervingly calm. The air around me grew colder, and I felt it then, something wasn't right. I was being pulled toward her, as if some invisible force was drawing me closer. I tried to back away, but my legs felt weak. Every step I took felt like wading through thick mud. The street seemed to stretch on forever, but when I looked behind me, the reflection in the window was still there, still watching, still waiting. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, everything blurred together. My feet carried me with no clear direction, but every corner I turned, every street I passed, the reflection was there, in every glass surface, in every shiny door, in every polished surface I came near. The feeling of being watched, hunted, never left me. I could sense her, no matter where I went. Eventually, I stumbled into a small park, the trees towering over me like dark sentinels. I collapsed onto a bench, my chest heaving with exhaustion. My hands shook violently, and I buried my face in my palms. Why couldn't I escape? What was happening? Suddenly, I heard something. A voice. It wasn't a whisper this time, it was clearer, more insistent. Come back. I froze, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The voice was familiar, but not in a comforting way. It was the voice from the mirror, the voice that had whispered earlier, the one that had called me toward the glass. Come back to me. I turned slowly, my head jerking toward the sound. From between the trees, a figure stepped into view. It was her. My reflection. But it wasn't a reflection anymore. She was standing there, in front of me, real and solid. Her clothes were different, darker, more tattered, and her face was twisted, broken, as though it had been shattered into 1,000 pieces and then hastily put back together. She smiled at me, her lips stretching unnaturally wide, as though her face wasn't meant to move in that way. "You can't run anymore." Her voice sent a chill down my spine. It was like nails scraping on glass, harsh and grating. I took a step back, my legs barely holding me. I needed to run. But where? The world was becoming smaller, tighter, as if everything was folding in on itself. "You're already here," the figure said, its voice distorting with every word. "You always were." The words didn't make sense. But the way she said them, the certainty, the finality, made my heart race. I backed up until I hit the cold stone of the bench. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. And then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The figure vanished into the darkness between the trees, like she had never been there at all. I was left standing in the park, the wind howling around me, and for a long moment I wondered if I had imagined it all. But I knew I hadn't. I knew what I had seen. And I knew that whatever this was, it was just beginning. The night felt unnaturally still, as if the world was holding its breath, just waiting. I stood there, alone in the park, the cold seeping into my bones. The trees loomed over me like dark, silent sentinels, their branches stretching toward the sky. Every rustle of the wind sounded like whispers. The figure, the thing that had once been me, was gone, but I could still feel her presence. I could still feel her eyes on me, even though I couldn't see her anymore. I turned and walked back down the path, my footsteps echoing in the silence, each one louder than the last. The streetlights cast long, thin shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, like they were reaching, trying to pull me back into the darkness. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape her. The reflection, my reflection, was always there. Waiting. Watching. As I passed a dark alleyway, I stopped. Something in the corner of my eye caught my attention, a glimmer, a flicker of movement. I turned my head slowly, but the alley was empty. The shadows were deep, the kind that swallowed everything in their wake. But then I saw it. In the glass of a storefront window, there it was. My reflection. But this time, it wasn't like before. The reflection was wrong. It wasn't mimicking my movements, it wasn't just a mirror image anymore. It was alive, it was moving in ways that I couldn't follow. The reflection stepped closer to the glass, its fingers touching the surface. And then it smiled. A smile I never made. A smile I couldn't make. I gasped, taking a step back. But no matter how far I moved, the reflection moved closer. Its hand was still pressed against the window, its fingers stretching through the glass as if it were trying to reach through to me. I turned around quickly, hoping the alley behind me would offer some escape. But the street was empty. There was nothing but the soft hum of the distant city. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I turned back to the window. The reflection was still there. But now, it wasn't just standing behind the glass, it was pressing against it, as if trying to break free. Its face, my face, was twisted in an expression of pure hunger, its eyes wide and unblinking, its mouth stretching open as if to speak. But no sound came. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my throat. I had to get away from this. I had to get home. I had to get away from the glass, away from the thing that wasn't me. I ran, not looking back, not daring to glance at any more mirrors, any more windows. I didn't know if I was running from the thing that was becoming me or from myself, but I couldn't stop. I reached the house in what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was colder now, like a storm was coming. The sky above was heavy, dark with clouds that seemed to reflect my anxiety. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. But even inside, I couldn't escape the feeling that the house was no longer mine. It was too quiet. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I ran to the bathroom, the one place that had started all of this. The mirror was still there, cracked, its jagged edges sharp against the dim light. I stared at my reflection, but it didn't look right. It never had. I reached out a trembling hand, but just before my fingers touched the glass, I stopped. I couldn't. Something deep inside me told me that the moment I did, everything would change. It had already changed, hadn't it? The cracks were spreading, the reality I knew was slipping away, and with each passing second, I was getting farther from the person I used to be. Suddenly, I heard a sound. A sharp crack. I turned quickly to find the mirror. No, the reflection, reaching toward me again. But this time, it wasn't through the glass. It was coming out of it. The reflection lurched forward, its form shifting and warping. The image in the mirror was no longer bound by the glass. It was pushing through, breaking free like liquid spilling from a jar. The jagged edges of the cracks in the glass seemed to twist and curl, as if they were alive, reaching for me. And then, it stepped out. My reflection, no, it was standing in front of me. The room around us distorted, twisting as if the laws of reality no longer applied. The reflection was grinning now, its teeth sharp, too sharp, its eyes gleaming with something dark and cold. "You can't hide," it whispered, the voice familiar, but not mine. It was colder, darker, more knowing. "You never could." I took a step back, my heart in my throat. I had to get away. I had to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The reflection was no longer just a mirror image. It was real. It was me. But it wasn't me. And it wasn't going to let me go. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. The reflection, no, the thing that had taken my form, smiled wider, its eyes now black. Pools, empty and endless. My heart pounded in my chest, but my body felt paralyzed, as if I were glued to the spot. I couldn't look away from it. It moved closer, its feet silent on the floor, gliding rather than walking. The floor beneath me felt like it was shifting, trembling, as if the house itself was coming apart at the seams. "You thought you could escape," the thing said, its voice twisted, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside my head. "You thought you could just break free. But there's no way out. You've already entered." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but the words caught in my throat. My legs refused to move. My mind screamed for me to fight, but I was frozen, staring into the abyss of my own reflection. The thing that wore my face reached out, its fingers long and unnaturally thin, like spider legs. It touched my cheek, its skin cold and rough, sending a jolt of fear through me. I gasped, but it was too late. A sharp crack split the air, and the room seemed to bend, distorting, stretching, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around me. The reflection grinned, showing too many teeth, stretching its mouth wider than any human should. It stepped forward, its cold fingers tightening around my wrist. "Now, you're part of this world," it said softly, its voice like a whisper in my ear. "You'll never leave." You'll never be you again. I struggled, forcing my legs to move, forcing my arms to break free from the creature's grasp. But it was no use. It was too strong, too powerful, as if it were made of something darker, something that shouldn't exist. The world around me was warping faster now. The walls were twisting, the floor shaking beneath me. The mirror that had once been a simple reflection was now a portal, an opening to something else, something far darker. I could see it. The reflection was pulling me toward it, pulling me into the abyss. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to block out the cold, the feeling of being swallowed whole. But I couldn't escape. I couldn't stop it. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was the reflection's voice, softer now, as if it was whispering directly into my soul. Goodbye. When I woke up, the sun was shining through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, trying to adjust. My head throbbed, and my chest ached with a cold, gnawing fear. But as I looked around the room, everything appeared untouched. The mirror was there, just as it had been before. It was whole, not a crack in sight. I stood up slowly, cautiously, my heart racing. My reflection stared back at me from the polished glass. I reached out, trembling, and touched the surface. My fingers brushed against it, and it was cold, too cold. But there was no sign of the thing, no sign of the dark, twisted reflection that had tried to pull me in. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, but as I turned away, something caught my eye. A small detail, barely noticeable, but enough to send a chill down my spine. A crack, just a hairline fracture, running along the edge of the mirror. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. And when I looked back at my reflection, I saw it. The smile. It wasn't mine. The reflection grinned at me, its eyes empty and dark, and for the first time, I understood. I hadn't escaped. The thing that wore my face was still here. It was still inside me, waiting. And it would never let me go. The mirror shattered. Have you ever found something that seems completely ordinary, only to realize later that it holds a part of your past, something so forgotten, so buried, that its very existence shocks you? That's exactly what happened to me. It was a dreary afternoon, and I was cleaning out my childhood home. After years of it sitting unused, my parents had decided to sell the house. As I sifted through boxes in the attic, filled with old clothes, books, and dusty trinkets, I thought I was prepared for what I might find. But I wasn't. The box was small, cardboard, with faded markers of things I barely remembered. It wasn't labeled, just thrown in with other forgotten items. At first glance, it looked like any other box filled with old toys I had played with when I was young. Yet something about it made me stop. I reached inside and pulled out a stuffed rabbit. Its fur was matted, its eyes dull and stitched with care. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen it. As I turned it over in my hands, something caught my attention, a small music box hidden inside the rabbit's body. I'd never seen it before, nor could I recall putting it there. Curious, I wound the key at the back. The music started soft and slow, like a gentle lullaby. At first, the sound was sweet, familiar even. But then, as the melody filled the room, something changed. The tune began to warp. It felt as though the music was getting louder and more distorted. The sweet melody twisted into something darker. A chill ran down my spine, and I froze, my hand still on the toy. The song, it wasn't just a tune I remembered. It was something more. Something I didn't recognize at first, but then the memory began to flood back. I remembered hearing it when I was a child. A song my mother used to sing to me at bedtime, but she never finished it. I had forgotten that song. I had forgotten her voice. The music grew louder, like a persistent whisper, pulling at my mind. My fingers trembled as I turned the rabbit in my hands, looking for any signs of a mechanism, a clue to explain what was happening. But nothing made sense. And then, as if it were somehow responding to my thoughts, the music stopped abruptly. The silence was oppressive. I felt my breath catch, and I glanced around the attic. The room, once filled with light filtering through the dusty windows, now seemed darker. The air felt heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something I hadn't yet discovered. Something connected to that song. But what was it? I reached for the music box again, but before I could wind it, I heard a noise behind me, soft, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. I spun around, but there was no one there. The attic was still. Dead still. The footsteps had stopped. Yet I couldn't ignore the eerie sensation that something, or someone, was watching me. My hand shook as I placed the rabbit back in the box. My eyes lingered on it for a moment before I slammed the lid shut. The music had been unsettling enough, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this toy had once been, it was more than just a childhood keepsake. It was a bridge to something I didn't want to remember. And as I made my way down the stairs, the echo of that haunting song still ringing in my ears, I realized that the past hadn't stayed buried. It had followed me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The melody kept playing in my head, looping over and over, as though it were a shadow trailing me in the dark. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it, a lullaby, familiar and soothing at first, but with something beneath it, a layer of darkness I couldn't quite touch. I tossed and turned in bed, trying to shake it off, but it lingered, like a whisper in the back of my mind. I got up at midnight, the silence in the house pressing in on me, and made my way downstairs to the living room. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the only sound in the otherwise quiet house. It felt different now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Something was wrong, I could feel it, but I couldn't explain why. The box. The toy. The song. All of it was pulling at me. I couldn't just leave it there, tucked away in the attic like nothing had happened. I needed to understand why it had affected me so deeply. Why had that song resurfaced now, after all these years? I found myself standing in front of the box, staring at the small stuffed rabbit. It sat innocently on the coffee table, its stitched eyes gleaming under the dim light. I reached for it slowly, hesitating for just a moment. As my fingers brushed against the fabric, I felt a strange warmth. The toy didn't feel like an object I'd left behind, it felt like it had been waiting for me. Carefully, I lifted the rabbit, inspecting it once more. The music box inside felt warm to the touch. I couldn't resist any longer. I wound the key again, and this time, the song played without hesitation. But there was something different. The tune wasn't just distorted, it was sharper, more urgent. The soft lullaby that had once filled the room now felt like an eerie warning, its notes sharp like knives. The music started to change, just like before, but this time I noticed something. A part of the melody, the same haunting part that had been playing in my mind all day, was different. The sequence of notes had shifted slightly, like a puzzle that was slowly rearranging itself. I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of it. And then, for a brief moment, it stopped. I looked around the room, heart racing. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. My breath was loud in my ears, and I felt as though I were being watched again. Slowly, I turned my attention back to the rabbit. The music box had fallen silent, but it was no longer sitting peacefully in my hands. The rabbit's eyes were no longer still. I swear I saw them move. The glass eyes blinked. Or at least, that's what it looked like. A subtle shift, like a reflection in a window on a windy day. But it couldn't be. It was just a toy. Just an old stuffed animal from my childhood. My fingers gripped the toy tighter, and I almost threw it across the room. But something inside me, some strange, compelling force, kept me from doing it. Instead, I stood frozen, staring into the rabbit's eyes, my own pulse pounding in my chest. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the feeling of unease passed. The toy went still again, and the room seemed to return to normal. But I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. Something had changed. I dropped the rabbit back into the box, this time slamming the lid shut. But as I did, I noticed something else. The music started again. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. But the melody was unmistakable. And this time, it wasn't coming from the box. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. The house was empty. And yet, the song lingered, echoing in the silence, as if it was trying to tell me something. I backed away from the table, my hands trembling. The house felt colder now. The familiar warmth of my childhood home was gone, replaced by an oppressive chill that I couldn't explain. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. Suddenly, I remembered something. A small detail from my past, one I hadn't thought about in years. My mother's voice, singing that very same lullaby, a song she used to sing when I was small. I could almost hear her humming it, so clear it was as if she were right there beside me. But she was gone. Gone long before the memories of that song had faded. The song, it wasn't just a melody. It was a message. A message from my past. And I had to find out what it meant. What was it trying to tell me? I reached for the box once more, determined to uncover the truth, but as my fingers brushed the lid, I felt it. A cold, damp breath on my neck. The room grew colder still. The music swelled. And this time, I knew it wasn't just the toy that had been waiting for me. It was something else, something darker, something from the past that had come back to reclaim me. The cold breath on my neck was unmistakable. I froze, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and the music, still playing softly, sounded louder now. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on me, as though the walls themselves had taken a step closer. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. Something told me that if I did, I'd see something I wasn't ready to face. I turned back to the toy, my hand shaking as I reached for it again. The melody had changed once more. It was no longer a lullaby, but something else, distorted and strange, like a plea, like a cry for help. The notes sounded twisted now, almost as though they were echoing from somewhere far away, from a place I couldn't see but could feel. I slammed the lid of the box shut with a force I didn't know I had, hoping to silence the music. But it didn't stop. The melody continued, louder and louder, filling the room like it was coming from everywhere at once. It was as if the very air was humming with it. I backed away from the table, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room felt as if it were closing in on me, as if the walls were bending and stretching, becoming something unfamiliar. I grabbed the nearest chair to steady myself, but the ground beneath me felt wrong. Soft, unstable, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. The temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath now, visible in the dim light. It was impossible, but there it was, rising in small, misty clouds before dissipating into the air. The sound of the music grew even more intense, the notes sharper now, cutting through the air like knives. I spun around, eyes wide, scanning the room. The house felt alien. The walls, the furniture, the pictures on the walls, they all felt distant, like I wasn't supposed to be here anymore. Like I was trespassing in a place I no longer belonged. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the window, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A shadow cast by the moon, maybe. But no, it was too solid, too defined. A person, or something that looked like a person, standing motionless, just out of the reach of the dim light. My heart slammed into my chest. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. I backed away, feeling the floor beneath me as though it were no longer solid, as if it could swallow me up at any moment. The music still echoed in the room, but it was now joined by something else, soft whispers, too quiet to understand but loud enough to send chills down my spine. The whispers grew louder, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that they were coming from the figure in the corner. It was calling my name. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place as the figure slowly stepped forward, its movements deliberate and slow, like it was savoring my fear. The whispers grew more distinct, the voice so familiar now that it made my stomach twist. It was my mother's voice. The room seemed to tilt around me, the walls shifting, stretching, as the figure advanced. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. All I could do was watch as the figure drew closer, the shadows around it deepening, swallowing the light. Then, suddenly, the figure stopped. It was mere inches away from me now, its face shrouded in darkness, but I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. The whispers stopped. And then, it spoke. "You've come back," it said, its voice eerily calm, but laced with something darker. Something colder. "You've come back to remember." The words sent a wave of panic crashing through me. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. I had to wake up, to break free from whatever this nightmare was. But the longer I stood there, the less certain I was about what was real and what wasn't. The figure's face came into view, and my blood ran cold. It was my mother. Or at least, it looked like her face twisted, her features stretched unnaturally, her eyes hollow and empty. Her smile was wrong, wide and jagged, as if it were painted on. The figure raised its hand, and I could feel it, this terrible sense of inevitability. Something was coming, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to survive it. "You remember this song, don't you?" it whispered, stepping closer. "You remember the lullaby. It never left you, did it?" The room darkened, and the temperature plunged again. The music was deafening now, filling every corner, every inch of the house. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my ears as the figure stretched out its hand to me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure's fingers grazed my cheek, ice cold against my skin. "It's time to come home," it murmured, its voice blending with the music as if the two were one. And then, the world around me shattered. I gasped as the world fractured. The room around me twisted, the walls collapsing inward in a violent rush of shadows and light. The figure in front of me, that grotesque version of my mother, seemed to dissolve, melting into the darkness like smoke. My legs buckled, and I fell to the ground, my arms flailing to catch myself. But there was nothing solid to hold on to. I tumbled, falling through the darkened abyss that swallowed the room whole. Everything blurred together, swirling in a vortex of fractured images, sounds, and emotions. The air felt thick, suffocating. The music, that horrid, distorted lullaby, continued to play, echoing around me as if coming from every direction, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was drowned by the relentless melody, by the whispers that had now merged into a single, incomprehensible chant. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, everything stopped. The music ceased. The whispers vanished. The darkness lifted. I opened my eyes, disoriented, my breathing ragged. I was lying on the floor of my own living room, my hands pressed against the cold wood beneath me. The room was quiet, eerily still. The familiar surroundings seemed wrong. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt right. I staggered to my feet, my heart racing in my chest. My reflection in the mirror across the room caught my attention. I froze. There, in the reflection, stood the figure again, the same twisted version of my mother. But this time, it was holding something, an old, tattered doll. The same one I had played with as a child, the one I had found in the box earlier. It was the toy that had started all of this. The toy that had brought me back to this place. But the reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. It moved on its own, just like before. The figure's eyes locked onto mine, and its smile widened, impossibly wide. "You should have listened," it whispered, its voice coming from the reflection, "but somehow not. You never should have come back." I backed away from the mirror, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The toy, it was still there, sitting innocently on the table in front of me. The lullaby continued to play, louder now, as if it were coming from the toy itself, not the mirror. I could feel the coldness spreading, the creeping dread wrapping itself around me. The reflection in the mirror stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, like it was struggling to move. "Don't you want to remember?" the figure asked, its voice now a harsh rasp. I shook my head, desperate to escape, but the room seemed to close in around me. My feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen, trapped in this nightmare. Suddenly, the mirror cracked. A deep, resonating crack that echoed through the room, sending a shockwave of fear through my entire being. I could feel the vibrations beneath my skin, the jagged lines spreading across the glass like a web. I couldn't tear my eyes away. As the cracks grew, the reflection of the figure warped, twisting into something even more horrifying. Its face twisted, stretching in unnatural ways, its eyes hollowing out into dark voids. The doll in its hands began to twitch, as though alive. The once still toy was now wriggling in the reflection, its tiny limbs moving in a grotesque dance. The room trembled. The ground beneath me shuddered. I felt as if the very foundations of reality were beginning to crumble. The music grew louder, the lullaby becoming a scream, a mournful wail that scraped against my mind. And then, just as suddenly as the madness had started, everything stopped. Silence. The mirror was shattered. The figure was gone. The room was empty, but the toy remained. I stumbled toward it, heart pounding in my chest. The doll was still sitting there on the table, its innocent appearance at odds with the chaos that had unfolded around it. I reached out for it, my hands trembling, and as I touched it, I felt something shift deep within me. A memory. A long-forgotten memory. A moment from my childhood, buried deep in my mind, surfaced like a painful splinter. I remembered the song, the lullaby. It was my mother's voice, but it wasn't just a song. It was a warning, a plea. The room grew colder, the air thickening with a presence that wasn't there before. I could feel it watching me. I could feel it waiting. The toy, the song, the figure, they were all pieces of something I didn't understand. And then, a voice whispered from the dark corners of the room, cold and distant, yet unmistakably familiar. You can't leave. You never could. The ground beneath me cracked open, and the world began to tilt once more. And I realized, too late, that I had never truly escaped. I had only returned to a place where the past never let go. I gasped, my breath coming in short, jagged bursts as the room spun around me. The darkness wasn't just in the corners now, it was seeping into everything, into the walls, the air, the very fabric of the house. The toy in my hands felt heavier, as though it were absorbing something from me. It wasn't just plastic and cloth anymore. It had become something alive, something that pulsed with a rhythm I could feel in my own chest. The song, that horrible lullaby, began again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the toy alone. It echoed from every corner of the room, wrapping itself around me, drowning out my thoughts. The voice, my mother's voice, was no longer sweet, it was frantic, desperate, and it seemed to come from within me. You can't leave. You never could, the voice whispered again, but now it was my own, mirroring my every fear. I dropped the doll, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The air was too thick, the weight of the memory pressing on me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The room was closing in. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen force, like the beating of a heart I couldn't escape. The door, my only exit, stood wide open, inviting me to run. I could hear the wind outside, a soft whisper of freedom. But the pull of the house, the pull of the memories, held me in place. I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor. I felt the walls pressing closer, as though they were breathing, suffocating me. I looked back at the mirror, and there it was, the reflection again. But this time, it wasn't just a mirror image. It was an extension of the nightmare. The twisted figure of my mother stood there, smiling that dreadful smile. Her face was pale, featureless, save for those hollow, black eyes. The doll, now animated, moving on its own, was no longer in her hands. It was crawling toward me, its tiny limbs jerking unnaturally, dragging itself like a thing desperate to reach me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But the words caught in my throat, and my body refused to obey. The reflection of my mother, no, it wasn't her, began to speak, its voice like an echo from another time, another place. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a command. You belong here. We all do. The words hit me like a blow, knocking the breath out of my lungs. I felt the weight of them pressing down on me, suffocating me. The walls were closing in faster now, and the shadows, those dark, living shadows, seemed to reach out for me, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I could feel the toy crawling closer, its tiny hands scraping against the wood floor, its eyes now locked onto mine with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. I reached down, my fingers trembling, and picked it up again. Its small, cold body seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were responding to my touch. The music stopped. The silence was deafening. But in the silence, I could hear something worse, something more chilling. Footsteps. Soft, echoing footsteps coming from behind me. Not just from the shadows. No, these steps were real, and they were coming closer. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the room. But I saw nothing but the oppressive dark that filled every corner. Then, the footsteps stopped. A voice, distant but clear, called my name. It's time to come home. I knew that voice. It was my mother's. But this was not my mother. It couldn't be. Not after everything that had happened. Home? I whispered, my voice cracking. What do you mean? I am home. But I wasn't. I knew that now. The room shifted again. The walls seemed to warp, and the floor beneath my feet began to tilt, sending me sliding to the center of the room. The air was thick with an unnatural pressure, and the toy in my hands felt like it was alive, squirming against my grip. Its cold eyes stared up at me as the lullaby began to play once more, its melody growing more intense, more frantic. I dropped it. But it didn't fall. It floated in the air before me, spinning slowly, defying gravity. And then, the toy spoke. Come home, little one. The words weren't just a sound. They were a command that echoed deep within my mind. It was like the toy wasn't speaking to me, it was speaking through me, forcing its words into my thoughts, into my memories. The room vanished. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, all disappeared, leaving only a void. I was falling through the darkness, through time, through everything. The lullaby played endlessly, its melody stretching into infinity. And then, I heard it. The voice again. You belong here. And then the fall stopped. The ground beneath me was soft, familiar. I was no longer in my house. I wasn't anywhere. I was in a place where the air smelled like old toys and dust, where the walls were lined with forgotten memories. I looked around, and there, standing in the shadows, was my mother. Her eyes were hollow, and her smile was twisted. But it was her. She was here. Welcome home, she whispered. The toy was in her hands again. And then I realized, too late, that I had never truly escaped. This place, this memory, this house, it was my home. It had always been. And now, I was part of it forever. The lullaby played, and I couldn't move. I had come back. And there would be no leaving this time. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.